immediately to Vivian Hill of this institute to do the formal welcome and introductions and housekeeping.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to say how amazing it is to see so many people here. We estimate we have about 25% of the educational psychology workforce in the hall today, representing 80 local authorities. That speaks volumes about the significance of this debate. Just to do some of the housekeeping, we will be having a short break, and it's only a comfort break. There will not be time to get everybody teas and coffees in that time frame. That's at 3:20. If you exit the hall and turn right, there are loos for both genders immediately outside the hall. But if you find that there's a huge queue, if you go up a level, you will find some in a similar position upstairs. We have fire marshals here. Would you please stand up and make yourselves known to the audience? Okay, our fire marshals will see you to the nearest exit, but in the terrible dilemma now about doing the air hostess demonstration, we have exits at the back of the hall, at the sides, and at the front. The assembly point is in Woburn Place, so you would leave the building and follow a fire marshal who will lead the way to Woburn Place, because we want to be sure that everybody here is safe. We're not planning to have a fire alarm practice, so if the alarm sounds, you do need to evacuate. Okay, so I now want to just set the context for today's discussion. When I'm teaching here, I'm the programme director for the DEd Psy here at the Institute of Education at UCL, and I'm always very clear with the students that probably the two biggest areas of controversy in applied educational psychology relate to dyslexia, the teaching and learning of reading, and intelligence theory. And at the end of my presentation, I think it will be clear perhaps why that might be. But what I wanted to do was just set the context for today's debate, because it was triggered by events in the House of Commons, well, no, House of Lords actually, House of Lords. Basically, they were having a debate about spectrum disorders, which meant they were looking at things like ADHD, dyslexia, and autism. And during this debate, Lord Addington of Warwick actually raised the issue about the policy statement that had recently been issued by Warwick County Council. And what he highlighted was that he had certainly been given the impression that the document was stating that dyslexia was effectively not something to worry about, and was asking for government assurance that there would be continued emphasis on accurate diagnosis, because that's seen as a life-transforming intervention for people with literacy difficulties. Lord Agnew, again, followed up and was saying how important early intervention was, and that actually the document from Warwick did talk about the value and the importance of early intervention and early identification. But what he considered was that Warwickshire needed to look very carefully about how they were going to implement their advice and be actually operating a policy that was consistent with the Equality Act. And at the bottom there, you'll see the definition of disability under the Disability Act. Lord Watson, so this is a very all-party debate. We've already covered Liberal Democrats, Labour, and Conservative peers having a shared perspective on this. And what I've highlighted here from this particular part of the debate is this clear belief that dyslexia is a medical condition. And this led to the sort of sense that if this is a medical condition, how can people be questioning its existence? And this is where we actually get the comment about flat Earth and global warming, the sense that how crazy must it be to conclude that a medical condition doesn't exist. And what he's saying is we need some guidance as a matter of urgency on this matter. Lord Stirling, who is a peer who, if you go online, you can actually read the debate, and what Lord Stirling went on to say is that he actually has a grandchild who is on the autistic spectrum. And what he had recognised is that actually the critical issue in responding to any spectrum condition seemed to relate to the huge shortage he describes as child psychologists, but he was actually referring to educational psychologists. He lives in a part of the country where there actually are no educational psychologists attached to schools. They provide only a statutory service. And he's been quite a powerful champion of educational psychology, having met with the minister and expressed concern about the rate of atrophy in the profession. And I think that's significant given the recent announcement of a 25% increase in training places for educational psychologists. And Lord Story goes on to talk about whether these policies are actually attuned to the requirements of the Children and Families Act. There is a sort of view that maybe there's false information being given, and what he was then asking was, would the government clarify whether they support the recognition of dyslexia as a disability and whether it should be defined under the Equality Act of 2010. And Lord Agnew then goes on to say that actually there aren't particular definitions apart from one or two within the Act, but actually it's defined by individual needs and the impact on an individual's daily lived experience. So that was on the 30th of October in the House of Lords. On the 31st of October, so the very next day, the Times Education Supplement led a headline about council's attack for saying dyslexia is questionable. And these are some of the things they highlighted. So this is what the Warwickshire Council policy actually says, and I don't think many of us would disagree with many of these points. That research in the area of dyslexia actually lacks consensus. That the techniques used to teach reading to children who are diagnosed as dyslexic are actually much the same that you would use with any struggling reader. That the diagnosis of dyslexia does not provide any additional information that's useful for addressing the difficulties, nor does it actually predict the rate of progress. And it's also widely accepted that the diagnosis of dyslexia is actually scientifically questionable and can be misleading. And I think it was probably with huge relief to the Educational Psychology Service that actually Warwickshire County Council supported the position statement as expressed there and felt confident that the guidance that had been produced and was being followed by schools was sound and that the needs of young children in their local area were actually being met. At the same time, Helen Bowden, Chief Executive of the BDA, announced to the TES that she said it was a first and an alarming precedent that could not be allowed to stand, so they didn't like the policy or any of the points it was making, and she claimed that the schools in the area interpreted the policy as meaning that the local authority would not actually assess children for dyslexia and that families had been forced into legal challenges to have their children assessed. She goes on to say there are clear responsibilities for a local authority around identifying individual needs and responding to parents' requests for assessments if their children are assessed. Now, in the interest of a fair and open debate, we had invited the BDA to attend today, but they declined to be present. We are hoping to give you a balanced view in the absence of the BDA, but there's their position. So for me, this brings us round to, as psychologists, actually, where are we now? We've had decades of debate about this topic. The fact that there are so many people attending here today is testimony to that. But the reality is that it's a very, very complex and difficult concept. So some of the greatest psychologists, including Professor Michael Rutter, he's saying that perhaps the biggest issue with dyslexia is how do we define it? until we have a very clear understanding of the construct and the concept, and that the definition of a concept usually comes first and the word follows. And in this case, it appears to have happened in reverse order. Keith Stanovich, an American psychologist who's done lots of research in the area, talked about the conditions that are needed to satisfy a scientific concept. So the need for a distinct phenotype, which we don't have, distinct heritability patterns, and distinct neuroanatomical characteristics. And then Ria Reason and Peter Pumphrey went on to say a labelling condition requires a distinct etiology, identifying characteristics, prognosis, and response to intervention. I think as practicing psychologists, we all know it's an awful lot more complicated than that. The BPS put together a working party that came up with this definition of dyslexia, which tried to neutralise the contention around the label of dyslexia. And I think that the movement has been very much about, rather than looking at subgroups within those who have literacy difficulties, recognising that all children and young people with literacy difficulties deserve to have access to support. And I think that's very much the message from Warwick in their policy statement. And what we need to do is to be thinking about how do we make that message consistent and clear from across the profession. So I think the challenge for us today is to think about the word and the concept and ways forward. Thinking about paradigms, you've seen that some of the peers were very confused thinking that dyslexia is a medical condition. What we seem to have is this conflict between the medical model and the biopsychosocial model. And I think it's our job to help clarify those positions so that people understand them better. We clearly need to be thinking about operating within the legislative framework of the Equality Act and the Children and Families Bill. And how do we communicate our professional opinion very clearly and very succinctly to service users and other professionals? And again, working with others to try and ensure that we move towards a consensus view. So today, we're trying to start that debate. We are using an online system. I know some of you may not be able to get online here, but those who are watching on the live streaming, you can use Metimen to actually register your questions for later on. We also have a hashtag, which is IOE-DEDSciDyslexia debate. And I look forward to hearing some of your questions later on today. I'm now delighted to hand over to Jules, who is going to do the next presentation.
Thank you. Our next speaker then is Jules Daulby from Dorset and County Council.
No, I'm a freelancer now. I used to work for Dorset Local Authority and I was a former Director of Education for the Driver Youth Trust.
Thank you. Good. Over to you. Be indicating times.
Thank you. What time would you like me to finish?
Sorry?
What time would you like me to finish?
By 2:30 at the very latest. Earlier if you can.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
But till 2:30, that's fine. Hello. I was impulsively volunteered to do this talk on Twitter with Professor Elliott, and I thought at the time, oh, what a great idea, and I'm standing up here now going, I'm really quite stupid to have said I'd do that. The British Dyslexia Association didn't want to do it, but I do feel passionate that we do need two sides of this debate. And so I'm probably coming from the anti-academic debate to a certain extent, although I hope to have some evidence to show you. So I've called this Is the Earth Flat? Because we are talking about science here, aren't we? And this is around scientific evidence, and the word I want to really think about here is the scientifically questionable, which I struggle with that term. I think we can be sceptical and possibly even scrutinise the term dyslexia. But to say dyslexia is questionable, I think brings in all sorts of problems with regards to judging the label, with regards to judging people, and with regards to judging the general sense in local authorities where people have been told they're dyslexic. So I'm going to move on and just say, yes, so is the earth flat? Well, until science moved on. Okay, I get that, I do. But actually, the more we're learning about dyslexia or literacy difficulties, then I think we are finding out more. And this is where I think science and dyslexia can go together. I'm just going to quickly turn on, because I can't have my presenter notes on here, so just excuse me while I do my password for my notes. Yeah, so I have the most ridiculous password as well, which doesn't help in nervous situations like this. So it exists in a more complex way than we previously understood. And it's certainly open to this scientific scrutiny, but it doesn't imply the negative connotations given by the notion that dyslexia is questionable, or as is diluted down to teachers and the media, that it doesn't exist. And this, for me, is one of the problems where we move to literacy difficulties, that what I hear in schools when we hear that is that it actually doesn't exist. And for me, that's an issue. It questions the person, and what is missing is that emotional and instinctive side of the debate. And I know, again, that's not scientific, but we do need to be thinking about the people that have the label dyslexia. And I think that's really important. I understand why Professor Elliott wouldn't use that, okay? And I kind of think of him as the Dr. Spock of the debate. So it's rational, it's scientific, it's analytical and logical. But there is another side to this debate. It's the self-esteem and the validation and the explanation. So the sheer relief from some children when you tell them that they have dyslexia. It explains to them why they're not reading and writing like they're typically developing peers. So I like to think of myself maybe as James Kirk. So I'm the Captain Kirk of this debate. I'm also the boss, just want to say that. So, but there is that other side to this, and I think it's very important to recognise the people involved in this label and the sheer empowerment that gives some people. So I'm going to run through some of the models that I understand, and I hope as EPs you'll understand too. The discrepancy model. So the idea that you could once diagnose dyslexia or assess for dyslexia just by an IQ and a gap with literacy in spelling and reading. Okay. When the Rose Review came up, it was much more around phonological awareness and verbal memory, verbal speed of processing, and also some co-occurring difficulties such as organisation, although that wouldn't necessarily give you dyslexia. And that, for most local authorities, is the model that is being used at the moment. It did miss out visual, and for very good reason. And we were talking about this earlier, about Stein, looking at visual dyslexia, or looking at Erland syndrome. I think it's really clear that dyslexia should be some form of phonological difficulty. But I think the holistic assessment too, that exploring the behaviour traits, looking at your family history, the birth and the childhood, and having that best fit analysis as a primary need is really important. So there are many specific learning difficulties, and they do overlap. And I read a lot about Professor Bishop, who talks about it depends which person you go to see will define your label. So if you go to see an occupational therapist, you may get the label of dyspraxia. I understand that, but I think it is quite clear still that you can see a primary need emerging. Neurodiversity is another term. I don't think any local authorities will be using this, but it's certainly a term that a lot of people with specific learning difficulties are starting to own themselves. And I think it's actually, I know there's quite a few people that hate that term, but certainly people that see themselves as neurodiverse are finding that an empowering term compared to neurotypical. So that might be a new one on the horizon. So I want to talk to you about a couple of case studies while I was in Dorset that for me really show why dyslexia should still be a label and certainly used for local authorities. I taught two identical twins, Craig and Daniel, in an FE college. So both twins were severely dyslexic and they had a statement, the old, what's now an EHCP plan. And I taught Craig for dyslexia, difficulties in FE, and Daniel, his brother, was taught by somebody next door, basically. But I knew them for 2 years, and I also did their disability student allowance, so their DSA applications. And I was astounded by how identical their scores were in every way, for their reading, their spelling, for their general underlying intelligence. And they were 18 going on 19, and neither of them could write. And they used Dragon Naturally Speaking, so you know the speech recognition. And their writing did look like a 6 or 7-year-old's. Craig particularly, I kept in contact with. He ended up doing a degree and got a first, and now he's studying for a PhD. He still can't write, handwrite and spell, and he does use Dragon Dictate. And he can read, but when we looked at his scores, his reading were within 100 for comprehension, okay, pretty average, but below average for him. His, I think he was 120, 125 for his general ability, but his decoding was 65. So we're talking about standardised scores here. So his decoding was 65 and his comprehension was 100. So he could understand what he was reading. And it was quite fascinating seeing that. And his brother was very similar. So for me, that really struck. It was the first person I think I'd met that was severely dyslexic. And his history was, the reason it's interesting is because they're identical twins. His history was that he couldn't get to school. So he's what the local authority would call a school refuser. Or he'd go to school and then he'd run off and climb gates. And he was so embarrassed about the fact he couldn't learn to read. His brother, though, wasn't bothered at all. His brother would stayed in school. So for those that early years development, for those first years, Craig didn't go to school and his brother did. And yet their scores were exactly the same between 18 and 19. So when we look at the Rose Review particularly, his stubbornness to intervention was there. He had a slightly higher score in decoding than his brother. And I like to think that was because I taught him. I don't think it was really. But he still couldn't hear in string, you know. And when we were doing his rapid automatic naming, it was so slow, I couldn't score it. So, you know, these are the people, if you take away dyslexia, I think it would really affect them. And I think it would affect them quite seriously. The other case study I want to use is a Year 1 group, and I'm glad John Walker's in the audience here from Sounds Right. It's a linguistic phonic programme. And I had a Year 1 group who, they were pupils that weren't making progress, and I had 6 of them. It was a 6-week programme, and I would see them once for an afternoon, once a week, and then every morning they would do the Sounds Right programme for their phonics with 2 TAs. So it was a programme that worked really well. It went on for 6 weeks, and at the end of those 6 weeks, one child did quite well. So they kind of, what we call graduated from the course, and they went back into their usual mainstream lessons. Another girl, I thought it would be really good if she did the course again. So she had made small steps in progress, but we really needed to work on her more, and particularly her language skills. And then there were 2 boys, again, twins, funnily enough, who absolutely made massive progress. In fact, they ended up the top of the phonics screening check for that year. And it was a real boost for them. So they completely did everything we needed to do for them, closed the gap, and they did really, really well on the programme. But there was one little girl there who was different from the start. And she came in, she was much more mature, I think, than the others. And she almost kind of nurtured the others and would almost teach them and help them. And she, for me, the course didn't really fit for her. Okay, she was very articulate. She was had really quite neat handwriting, okay, and she was, had a mature level of understanding. But the phonics, she was struggling far more than the others. Okay, and what we did at the end of those 6 weeks, she didn't make any progress at all within her phonics. I sent her away and I said, I think she needs to be assessed. We need to look further at what's happening with her. For the other 5 in that group, it was a really good provision. And that's where I think there's some issues around this, because she was different. And it was pretty much obvious right from the start that she was slightly different. I'm not saying she shouldn't have intervention, but I suggested that she go away and get assessed, and then that she should have one-to-one intervention. And I hope, I wasn't there the following year, but I hope that happened. I hope she didn't blame herself for that. I hope she did get an explanation as to why she wasn't improving in the same way as her peers. So they're just 2 case studies that I've come across, but I have come across many, and I'm sure you all have too, of seeing those people that are slightly different. Local authorities, again, I just want to talk about the idea of language and resources, because I do think there's a slightly cynical element to this, which could be an issue. So I ran a speech and language base within a comprehensive school, and it was decided that it would become a complex communication base. The reason for that, to begin with, was that the scores to get into the speech and language base were really clear. So you had to have a real discrepancy model, really, between your speech and language and your underlying ability. And it was very rigid, so it meant that there were some students that would have really benefited from that secondary speech and language base, from the speech and language therapists that were coming in, and from the level of interventions that they were getting. And we felt that we needed to broaden that category to allow them in. But within 2 years, we argued for 2 years, a bit like the dyslexia debate, we argued for 2 years about what that should look like. What's happened now, however, is that the complex communication base is really, in all effect, an autism base. So it now has children with autism. I'm not saying they don't need that provision, but actually the children with speech and language difficulties have gone straight back into the class with a package, and that usually is an hour speech and language therapy once a week. So they're not benefiting now from this base. So I also am quite sceptical about the idea that we are going to give resources to children with literacy difficulties. I do wonder if we take away dyslexia and this, that actually the same thing will happen that's happened to these bases, that actually these children will just end up back in mainstream with no provision at all. So that's one of my concerns. So, is dyslexia inequitable? And I know Professor Elliott will talk about this, that actually we have these terms like it's a middle class disease, that only the middle class get it, that only children that are diagnosed with dyslexia will get the interventions that they're required. So is it inequitable? I don't believe it is. And actually, certainly in Dorset, I found most children that I assessed for dyslexia were not from middle-class backgrounds. They actually were from disadvantaged backgrounds. And they'd gone through the old wave system. So we've gone from wave 1, which we now call universal. So they had universal strategies in the classroom. And then they went to targeted provision, the wave 2. So then they had interventions within the school, in-house. And then they would go to specialist if they were still not making progress. Again, I don't believe that isn't going to happen if you take away dyslexia. You're still going to need those 3 stages of universal, targeted and specialist. And if they get to specialist, we are still going to have to assess them in whatever way to find out why they're not making progress. So by taking away the term dyslexia doesn't make that a difference. We're still going to have that assessment. So the justification that we won't have to have these long assessment procedures if we don't use the term dyslexia, I don't believe is going to happen. For me as well, for those children that aren't making progress, I think it's empowering. It's a term that they understand and it empowers them. I know I will hear people say, well, what about the ones that don't get that? But there usually is an explanation for the children that are not making progress, that have literacy difficulties? So my question is, why would we want to ban such a positive label? It's codified. If I say dyslexia to a taxi driver, if I say dyslexia to my employer, if I say dyslexia to a teacher, it's codified. We understand roughly what it means. Okay, it's one word and 4 syllables. It's an explanation. And actually, as Professor Bishop would argue, it's utility. It's a term that is good for research. It's a term that's good to understand the child very quickly. I don't understand why we'd want to lose that. It's one of the few labels that is positive, that people are actually quite proud to say to somebody, oh, well, I'm dyslexic. So why would we want to ban that? For me, it is about science, I agree. Okay, and we are finding out more and more about dyslexia, about literacy difficulties, about other specific learning difficulties. But I think it's compatible. Okay? We believe in things that have no science behind them, and yet there is lots of evidence here that children with literacy difficulties may have dyslexia. It can be compatible with the science. We're learning more and more all the time. For this debate, I think I read so much. So I read about Snowling and Goswami, and I've read all sorts of books, and there is more and more research coming that there are differences. One particular study found quite a significant difference in balance. So they took on children with dyslexia and children without, under a very strict criteria of dyslexia, and found that their balance was weaker. We are learning more and more all the time. And so the term dyslexia can help us as well, as we find out more. My question really to you is, if we take away dyslexia and we use literacy difficulties, who's next? And I purposely use who rather than what, because again, it is the people we're talking about here. It is the people that understand their difficulties that can have it explained away. So developmental language disorder, what we used to call SLI, is that going to go next? What's the difference between that and dyslexia? How do we measure a language disorder compared to dyslexia? Will we get rid of that one? ASD, autistic spectrum disorder. Again, we might have some children with autism that are very obvious, but the more high-functioning that we used to call Asperger's, that has already gone from the DSM, and then we've got this broad category of ASD. Do we start getting rid of those ones and just saying, well, you know, they just have social communication difficulties? So we could move to literacy difficulties, language difficulties, communication difficulties. What is that going to tell us? And ADHD, I think possibly one of the most controversial at the moment. Amanda Spielman, from the head of Ofsted, said that it was a term used by parents to excuse poor behaviour. Is ADHD the next one to go? Are we going to question the attention difficulties for those types of children? So these are all terms that are useful, I believe, and signify certain difficulties. And yes, they do all overlap. There's no doubt about that. But there is a primary need that can, I think, be taken from them. We could have a utopia, couldn't we? We're all winners in this world of utopia, where there's no labels exist, support is based on need, and we can all succeed in school. I don't think we're at that utopia yet. And actually, if local authorities started to put resources in and identify children based on need, I think it might be a time later on. But I don't see that yet. I don't see we're at a utopia where everybody is supported and based on that need. We're not all winners yet, certainly. If anything, at the moment, with resources as they are, it's almost worse. So to lose the label, I think, in the mainstream, means it doesn't exist. And I know Professor Elliott's often called the professor that says dyslexia doesn't exist, and I know he doesn't mean that. He knows that literacy difficulties are there, and there are reasons for them. But really, in the mainstream, that term, it doesn't exist, is a really powerful one. Rather than individual needs being met, none are met, and we become homogenous. The trouble is with that, is that if we treat everybody the same, and if we have this broad category of literacy difficulties, then some people may fall flat on their face, and they won't get the support that they need. Who suffers? Those who used to have the label. Suddenly we go back to, they're lazy, they're stupid, they could try harder. I believe it's a retrograde step to take away such a useful term. And that has happened before dyslexia. You know, I've met parents that are very passionate about having their children assessed for dyslexia because they had such a terrible time at school. Are we going to go back to that? Are we going to go back to literacy difficulties meaning that you could try harder and that you're not going to understand anymore? We're going to have an audience participation moment. Sorry about that, but don't worry, so you're not going to embarrass yourselves. I just want you in your mind's eye to think about, to visualise what a canoe is. Okay, so just in your mind's eye, what is a canoe to you? Okay, just visualise what that looks like. Okay, and I just want to just have a show of hands. That is much audience participation you're going to be forced to do, I promise. A show of hands who thought of this. Okay, generally a lot of you thought of that, okay? And actually for American English particularly, that is the term that you could use, okay? Did anybody think of this? Okay, so quite a few too. And actually, in America particularly, they will distinguish between canoe and kayak. Pretty much in England, we don't necessarily distinguish between the two, unless you're somebody that's really into canoeing and kayaking, which I'm sure there will be some of you there. Okay, did anybody think of this? No. Okay, now, for me, it's still water-based, okay? It's got people facing forwards. Okay, it's propelling in the water without an engine. It floats on the water. All right, so the difference, what is the difference between a pedalo and a canoe and a kayak? It's obvious, isn't it? But actually, when you start to define what a canoe is, then it could be this. For me, to lose the label doesn't move us forward. It returns us to the flat earth belief system, despite having far more knowledge than we previously had. And our literacy difficulties mean nothing. I'm sorry, I can't read that one. I'm going to have to put mine up. My very long thing again. So it's not a perfect system. I'm going to read this to you because you can't see it on this slide, sorry. It's not a perfect system, but by denying the label and instead choosing literacy difficulties means nothing and ignores those who are different. Rather than empowering them, we are telling them that they don't exist. And keeping dyslexia, for me, is a label is the equitable thing to do. And for me, it is around equity. It's not a middle-class disease, or as was recently put in the Times Ed, that it's a get-out-of-jail-free card for children in schools. It means something to children, and there is a difference. The last thing, how long have I got, Mr. Professor? What time do you want me to finish?
As soon as you can.
Excellent, okay. I think he's had enough of me. Okay, so for me, the last thing I want to talk about, there are two things for me on dyslexia that are the idea of resources that you will get if you're dyslexic compared to if you're not. I'm not sure if that happens in schools anymore. It might still in HE, so when you go for your disability student allowance, but it certainly doesn't make any difference to exam results anymore, exam access arrangements. You can have extra time, you can have a reader, you can have a scribe, you don't need to have the label as dyslexia for that. So it doesn't give advantage in that way. For me, the advantage is around empowering the person, empowering the child, and giving them an explanation as to why they are struggling. I would, if anything, which I think America's done, widen the label and give more people the term dyslexia as opposed to fewer. I wanted to leave you with that final question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jules. And our next speaker, is that the right one? It is, isn't it? It's the right one. Hello, that's better. Right, yes, thank you, Jules, very much. And now our next speaker is Professor Joe Elliott from the University of Durham, who's going to take a moment to tuck this into a pocket, I think, rather than have to hold it.
This is the clicker, is it?
Yeah.
Right. There's the clip. Right. And then just tuck it properly. Box into it. That's it.
Yeah, I use these quite a lot.
That's it. Does it work?
Yeah, it will do, yeah. It just takes a bit of time.
That's it. Good.
One,
You're there.
one, two, like
Yeah.
halves.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to put forward a rather different counter-argument to Jules. Thank you ever so much for filling up the gap. There was a bit of a void that you filled. Thanks for that, Jules. I did like the analogy of Star Trek, and I quite like the idea. But I kind of saw our position and that of Warwick, who get up later in Staffordshire. We're the people in the Starship Enterprise. But then I began to think a bit more, and I thought, you know, the analogy doesn't work, because actually, with our friends the BDA not here today for some strange reason, which I don't understand, at least the Klingons show up to do battle. But anyway. Thank you. Applause. Well, okay. Somewhere at this very minute, somewhere in the world, there will be a situation where there are two parents agonizing over their child. This child's 10 years old, reading at a 6-year level. The child started school age 4, bright, alert, happy, excited about school, taking the books back home from school. But gradually things seemed to go wrong. Gradually, the child didn't seem to be making progress with their reading. They began to become sort of hesitant, nervous looks across the breakfast table, anxiety, words with the infant school teachers. This carries on for some years, increasing the ramp up the tension. Now the child is nearly close to secondary school, and they're just going to go soon, and parents are totally beside themselves. What on earth are we going to do about our child? Along comes Auntie, and Auntie says, you know, you've got this real problem with Sarah. Have you ever thought, maybe she's dyslexic? Have you had it checked out? And the parents said, well, we did think about that, but we did mention it to the teachers in the school. Oh, don't take any notice of the teachers in the school. They don't know anything about this. What you need to do is to see a really super expert who really understands this stuff, and we'll use psychological tools and tests to really get close to the understanding of Sarah's problems, and they will find out if she's dyslexic or not. So parents say, okay, we'll do it. So they take the child, 10 years old, 6 years reading age equivalent, they take the child for the assessment. And guess what? The child is diagnosed dyslexic. Unsurprisingly. And then the parents come back and they're overjoyed. They're overjoyed because they feel at last someone really understands their child. At last we've someone who really, a real expert who can divine what the nature of the problem is. At last we've found someone. So and now we know what's the matter with Sarah. Secondly, now we know what the matter with Sarah is, we will know how to help her, what we need to do. We put into place the right forms of intervention for the dyslexic child, which will help her make progress. We've wasted all these years, but now we're there. And thirdly, we will get the resources. We will get the help that our child needs. The first one of those is absolute nonsense. The second one is meaningless. And the third one is true, actually. I'll come back to you on that one later, Jules. The third one's true. They probably will get resources that they might not otherwise have got. But the question about that is it equitable? Remembering your slides there, and I'll explain why it's not in a moment. So, what basically the kind of model that this assumes is that out there's this big pool of poor readers, struggling readers, and that somehow within that pool there are some kids who have a subset condition called dyslexia. And the expert's job is to work out whether or not this particular child has this profile, which then it would enable them to be diagnosed as dyslexic. And you need to have psychological tests to do that. This is the model. And then when you ask them about, well, what's the kind of research you base this belief upon, they will cite all sorts of world-class researchers. So these kinds of people, and it doesn't matter too much about the actual text here, but the first one, Peterson and Pennington, writing in The Lancet, which is the top medical journal. Interesting, we were talking about medical ideas before. So in The Lancet, where they did their kind of state-of-the-art review of what dyslexia is, it's the normal end, the low end of a normal distribution. Mark Seidenberg, 2017, the definitive book on reading disability now. I mean, it's the text to go to. He likes the word dyslexia, but he's basically saying it is poor readers on the low end of the normal distribution curve. Maggie Snowling, who the BDA will quote until the cows come home. And what does Maggie Snowden say? Is another word for poor reading. So first thing we have, which is a problem here, is that all the top researchers in the world who do this stuff are using the term dyslexia to describe all poor readers, apart from those who obviously don't read because they're got a major sensory problem with hearing hearing or vision, or they've never been to school or something like that. But the kind of kids we're talking about, the kind of kids we have problems we're wondering about, all the top researchers in the world use the term dyslexia as synonymous with that population. But actually, when you go into the practitioner world, the world of the diagnostic world, it suddenly switches. For no clear reason, it suddenly becomes a subset under some weird criteria. So let's look at some of these criteria. Well, one of the things we might want to do... let's just stick with the British Psychological Society for a moment. This is the slide that I think that Vivian put up. So when you talk to people in these kind of organisations, and you say, well, how do you define dyslexia then? And they'll say, BPS, DCP definition. So you go to that, or the Rose Report definition. You go to it, and what you find is it describes any child that you ever come across who's struggling to learn to read in a school situation. Show me a kiddie. I used to teach, I was a school teacher of special needs. Show me a kiddie, or I was a child psychologist, educational psychologist. I believe my old boss is in the audience here somewhere. I haven't seen it yet, but she'll probably have words from me at the end. Show me any of those kids who don't fit that definition. So then, the definitions that people use describe all poor readers, but the dyslexia industry, if I call it that for a moment, the dyslexia industry somehow sees it as a subset, even though this is the definition they're using. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So, let's move on. Jules mentioned America, because dyslexia has arrived in America in the last few years. It wasn't really there. Even when we were writing the Dyslexia Debate book, which we published in 2014, my co-author, Elena Grigorenko, said to me, well, of course it won't be that interesting in America, because they don't really use the term dyslexia, but now it's spread across the Atlantic, And now it's going around there. And this is one of the, people who fund, major funders of research, talks about this kind of, this undiagnosed, people are struggling. It's kind of a hidden condition. And they're struggling. It's undiagnosed. It's not spotted. It's not known. Well, if we're talking about poor readers, if you've got a child of 10 who's reading at 6-year level in your school, that is not hidden. So who are they talking about? Who are these people who we don't know about, who are in the schools, if we are talking about poor reading or struggling reading? Well, thankfully, the Times Educational Supplement helped us out with a flowchart. And so in here, we've got dyslexia in the middle, and all you've got to do is you go to the centre, and then you just follow all those lines out, and if you find some of those things, there's your dyslexics. They actually produced... I think Caroline from the TS is in the audience here somewhere, so I better be careful. But they also did a flowchart on dyspraxia, which is virtually identical, which was quite interesting. But the kind of the symptomatology of this is that you identify this huge long list of symptoms that you find in children who struggle to learn to read. And this long list, and then in that long list, there will always be some of those things that you will tick off for any child you ever see. And when you tick off those few that you ever see, then you turn around and you say, these are the symptoms of dyslexia. And then you've got this subgroup, which doesn't make sense, because there's no kid I've ever worked with who had severe reading difficulties who didn't have some of those. I mean, it just didn't happen. What you've got is something called pareidolia. It's a condition, all right? And it's basically what you do is you interpret a whole load of stuff that you see before me, and you see something there that may not be seen by someone else. So within the dyslexia kind of diagnostician world, you have this long list of things, and at the very top we have phonological awareness. And phonological awareness is one element that is quite commonly found as a problem for poor readers. All the research is looking at poor readers. If you're a poor reader, there's a high chance there's a phonological component, difficulty in there somewhere. Working memory, not so prevalent. Working memory problems are more likely to be found in children with reading difficulties than in populations of children who are normal readers, but by no means all of them. Rapid naming. Well, rapid naming again, and it depends which language. If you're looking at Finnish or you're looking at Italian, you will find rapid naming predicts much better than it does in a language like English, which is opaque. So rapid naming, working memory, speed of processing, balance, organizational skills. Virtually everything you will find greater numbers of those things in children who do not read well. But none of them are sufficient or necessary to make any kind of judgment about a diagnostic category which then impacts upon action. And so basically it's just people find things in there, hunt around, you will find it in every child, you will find something there. And so all those lists are lists of kids who are poor readers, not lists of so-called dyslexic children. It's really, really important that that's absolutely clear. Some years ago, after we made a TV program, some guy phoned me up, and I picked up the phone, and he said, "I'm really cross." And I said, "Well, there's a lot of people cross with me." He said, "If you want to have a go at me, can you phone back in a couple of days? You have to get in the queue." He said, "Not you," he said, "the British Dyslexia Association." I said, "What's the matter with them?" And he says, "Well, they don't know what they're talking about. On their website, it says that dyslexics have a very poor sense of rhythm." I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I'm severely dyslexic." He said, "And I've got a wonderful sense of rhythm. I play in a band, for God's sake." And then he said the usual line I get, which is, "You want to spend a day in my company?" You wouldn't believe how many invitations I get to spend a day in people's company. "Spend a day in my company, then you'll know what dyslexia is." And of course, one of the whole myths of this kind of thinking is that people interpret this diagnostic condition as they are symptomatic, emblematic of this condition. And if you only look at them, then you know what it is we're talking about. The fact that someone else looks totally different set of difficulties, and they think the same thing, is something that gets missed quite a lot. And that's why talking about case studies, with all respect to Jules, talking about case studies is not helpful, because you can use case studies to prove anything. Okay. Now, the biggest problem, of course, where the dyslexia industry took off like a Saturn V rocket was over the whole issue of intelligence. And this is a slide from many years ago, and what we've got in here was this dichotomous bifurcation between stupidity and bad eyesight. And the idea here with this is that maybe your child who's not reading well, maybe your kiddie isn't stupid, maybe they just need a pair of glasses because they've got myopia. And of course, historically, there was this association between intelligence and reading, such as that obviously this is highly problematic for people because they're struggling to learn to read and there's no intelligence problem at all here. And so when they had the discrepancy model of IQ, it was immensely powerful because it's a way of batting back any suggestion, any attribution that somehow this poor reading is down to do with low G, low general intelligence, low ability of some kind. And this is what took the dyslexia industry into the stratosphere because, of course, this was the means by which you could bat away these kinds of false. And I understand why. If I was a person struggling to learn to read, or I had a child who was struggling to learn to read, and people were saying I was stupid, I could understand why this label could be very powerful to you to help deal with those kinds of issues. But there are problems with this. And the major problem is that IQ's got nothing at all to do with decoding. It doesn't predict in any way whatsoever. You cannot use IQ to make a meaningful differentiation within a population of children who are poor decoders. If you get a whole bunch of discrepant IQ kids who are poor readers and you get a whole bunch of non-discrepant IQ poor readers, there's no difference in terms of the way they present, there's no difference in terms of what you do about it in terms of intervention, and there's no difference in terms of the long-term prognosis. So, even our friends at the International Dyslexia Association and the British Dyslexia Association, even these guys now put on their website that actually dyslexia, as they understand the term, occurs across the full spectrum of intellectual ability. Obviously not where we're talking about people with no language and so on, the profound end. I'm talking about within the sorts of populations you'd find within school systems, mainstream school systems. So what we've got here, and there's no difference about that. So the IDA, that's the American lot, they basically say no difference. And then what we've got in the Rose Report is basically they say dyslexia occurs across the full range of intellectual abilities. And this was on the BDA website. So I was a little bit, I don't know about you, I'm a bit of a sad person. Boxing Day, 26th of December, I'm looking at the BDA website. Okay, you've got to be desperate, I know, but I'm looking there. And what do I find? A nice, interesting remark on the BDA website written by the head of training for the British Dyslexia Association. And it actually says here that it isn't just about poor reading and spelling, it's about phonological awareness, processing speed, working memory, automatization, which is what most poor readers have problems with. But the interesting thing was, they talk about full assessment, and then it says, which nearly made me fall off the chair, it actually says a child who's just a poor reader would probably also have poor underlying ability, IQ that is, and therefore would be classed as low ability. And the difference between that and dyslexia is a range of difficulties across the above areas, but also a discrepancy between underlying ability, i.e. IQ, and scores in reading, writing, and spelling. And what's going on at this situation is that these kinds of organizations know damn well they can't do it. They know there's no scientific evidence to support it. They will not put it on the website in most places, but the practice is still the discrepancy model. People are still going out there saying, your kid's high IQ, poor reading, they're dyslexic. Why? Because the market wants it. Not because of science, but because of the power of the market and the power of this idea that you dissociate it in this way, even though you can't. Sophistry, in my opinion. And this is the kind of thing. And one of the problems, of course, that does, it promulgates the idea that the kids, poor readers who are not dyslexic, they're the stupid ones. We're talking about a zero-sum game here. And this is, again, where I'll take issue with Jules on these things. We'll come back to this in a minute. So, the first point I'd like to make then is that there is no way of clearly identifying a dyslexic subgroup that operates within a wider pool of poor readers. Once you take out, obviously, as I said, youngsters with severe hearing impairment and visual impairment and so on. There is no way of doing this. What people are doing is just finding any kind of difficulty in there, and there will always be some, identifying those and using those to legitimate the diagnosis. It doesn't stand up. No one has ever been able to come to criteria. Now, that is different to the other ones, because Jules mentioned ADHD, and however much you may not like the term ADHD, and you certainly may not like the medicalization of the term, but actually there are criteria for a diagnosis of ADHD in Diagnostic Statistical Manual 5, the American Psychiatric Association. There are criteria, you may not like them, but there are criteria, and there are interventions which fit on to the diagnosis. So the first point I'm making is there are no criteria to make a decision about dyslexic or not dyslexic, even though people are still using discrepancy models. But the next question is then, is there a treatment once you've got this label? Is there something you do for a dyslexic child that you don't do for a poor reader? And the simple answer is most parents think there is, and the reality is there is not. There is no treatment for a dyslexic child, additional to or different from what you do for any other kid. Let's talk about theory for a minute. So I can't go through this because I haven't got long enough, but in the writings I've done, and I've written about the different theories that have been presented about dyslexia. But of course, the theories are theories for children's reading difficulties. They use the word dyslexia in the scientific literature to describe the full population of kids with reading difficulties, not a subgroup of dyslexics. And these are the theories. And we start with our dear friend phonological awareness down there, that deficit there. And then we move down to rapid naming and working memory, short-term memory. And then we've got all the auditory stuff, and we've got magnosia to do with brain functioning, visual attention, visual processing, psychomotor processing, all the movement, the balance, the proprioception, and so on. Look at all the theories. Everyone's out there, and they've all got a different theory, and it's all over the place what these different theories are. But the reality is, how many of these have an intervention that has been shown by research to make a difference to a child who is a struggling reader? Anyone have a shot at this? This is my audience participation section. So, how many of these theories have an intervention linked to them that makes things better? Someone said all of them, and the rest of you said none. Actually, there's one. The phonological awareness stuff. There is evidence that if you, particularly with young children, that if you work on the phonological awareness of young kids, it will help as part of a broader program involving structured phonics and other kinds of intervention. But what this research is saying is this works for all kids who are struggling to learn to read, in the sense, again, it's not a thing for a subgroup of so-called dyslexics. The rest of this stuff is scientific kind of theorization and argumentation, which doesn't really impact at all upon our everyday practitioner lives because there's no evidence yet of what we're going to do about it. So what about the interventions that people put forward for dyslexia? Well, one of the things that psychometricians would love to be able to say is, we do all these high-powered tests of underlying cognitive processes, okay? And when we've identified the deficit areas of these cognitive processes, we then put into place cognitive training programs which will address these underlying cognitive deficits. We improve the cognitive processing, the cognitive functioning in that area, and then, and that's improved, then in turn reading will improve. And the reality is, it doesn't work. You cannot, there's no evidence that we can do much about these underlying cognitive processes. A marvelous paper by Simons, Susan Gathercole and others have done a beautiful, huge report on brain training exercises and shown that you cannot do it. Working memory training, forget about it. You can improve working memory in a lab by giving the same exercise over and over and over again. Eventually, kids will get better at it. There is no transfer out of the lab into the main life of classrooms. And then there's even less transfer. If you can get less than zero, there's even less transfer from the classroom into academic performance. You're wasting your time. So this whole idea of cognitive training, cognitive exercise and so on, won't work. Auditory processing, well, Fast for Word, which came out, Paula Talal's work, Haskins Laboratory in the United States in Connecticut. This was very, very big a few years ago. A lot of people were buying into this auditory training stuff, until it was really science demonstrated that it didn't work. It's almost kind of totally disappeared now as an intervention. So I don't know of any really, where people are really seriously trying to do auditory training in a way which is helpful This is not the same as phonological awareness. This is to do more with more kind of bass sounds. Visual exercises. Forget about it. There is no training for visual. You can't do visual ocular training. You coloured lenses. Nothing you can do there at all has been shown to make a difference to children with reading difficulties. There's no evidence for that. I can cite the work. I've even got a slide from the American Pediatric Association which will tell you all this, but I haven't got time to put it up unless it comes in the questions. So forget about visual training. Apart from the placebo effect, maybe give some kid a glasses, blue lens glasses, and they believe it might work. It might help them persevere, stick in a little bit harder, maybe that rises things up a little bit, but that's as far as it goes. Motor training. Coming back to the balance thing, there's some evidence that, like most of these kinds of problems that kids have to do with the developmental problems of one kind or another, nearly all those kids are more likely to have motor difficulties, slightly more likely to be clumsy, or poor hand-eye coordination, proprioception, that's kind of awareness of your body in space, that kind of stuff. Slight evidence of that. But actually, the idea that you can do some kind of psychomotor training and improve reading, every generation a program comes up, it becomes big, it's on the 6 o'clock news, and then it just disappears into kind of oblivion, and then comes up another generation later. No evidence any of that stuff will make any difference. And again, it's quite clear that those kinds of exercises at the current time, we do not know how to do anything physical that's going to help kids become better readers in that kind of way. Forget about all that stuff then. The only thing you can do, and this is what Frank Velutino said, and Maggie Snoning was co-author, Jack Fletcher was another author of this amazing paper in 2004 in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, seminal paper this. Basically said, and it's as true in 2019 as it was in 2004, that what the practitioners and the clinicians should be doing is moving away from these psychometric underlying cognitive tests to look at some kind of underlying cognitive or biological causes of some kind or another to come up with a category. Don't invest all your money and your resources and your time in that. Spend your time assessing the actual skills, the proximal skills you're interested in, and intervene at those levels. Focus on the actual reading literacy skills themselves and try and put activities in there to put that energy. And Frank Velutino, Maggie Snoning, Jack Fletcher, world-leading authorities of saying this. It's as true then as it is now. There is nothing else. People believe there's these esoteric things out there. There aren't. So this is the situation then. There is no specialized form of effective intervention for so-called dyslexic kids, however you want to identify these kids, that differs in any way from those which have been shown to be effective for all poor readers. So, given that is absolutely incontrovertible, why do we need to waste so much time and energy identifying a subgroup of dyslexic kids who get a lot of time, a lot of attention, a lot of help, pulled out, leaving a whole load over there that don't get that? Why would we do that? What's the logic behind this? Particularly when the tools to make this, identify this subgroup, have no scientific status whatsoever. Now let's get on to the third part then. So the first part about these parents are happy was because they thought they were getting a serious diagnosis. Secondly, they thought they were going to get some intervention that followed from this diagnosis. Thirdly, at last we're going to get some resources. And this is a really important point, whether or not resourcing is equitable or not. Now, there's lots of different kinds of resources. There's actually cash that pays for additional help in school. There's also the other kind of resource, the resource of the understanding teacher or the parents or the thinking or the attributions people make of the child who is dyslexic as opposed to not dyslexic. Resource operates not simply in terms of finance, is in terms of the way that people respond to you. And if getting a diagnosis of dyslexia leads people to operate more favorably with that child, then surely that's as important that the children who have reading difficulties who don't get that diagnosis also get that kind of favorable response from the professionals concerned. But let's just stick with good old pounds, shillings and pence for a minute. Have a look at this youngster. I'm not betraying any confidential information here. This kiddie is all over the internet, and he's all over the newspapers and so on. I just pulled this one out as a typical case. So this is a kid. It's quite interesting, the photograph. You couldn't, if you wanted to produce a photograph, that really was going to work well on the local newspaper about this kid who really needs it. You've got a kid there with lovely combed hair and the school blazer tie and a hand to this like the thinker from some Greek classical statue. And I'm not knocking this kiddie. This kid has needs. I'm absolutely certain has needs for help and so on. I'm not knocking that, and I'm not knocking parents. But let's just think about a societal level for a moment. So this mum went around and got 5 different educational psychologist reports. I think they finally got one that said he was dyslexic. If you do it, if you go around enough people, you'll get one in the end. So basically, these showed that he was bright and intelligent, and that here's the thing: it wasn't simply I need to know whether my kid's dyslexic, but once I've got that label, I now want the local authority to pay for my child to go to an independent school to get highly expensive education. And if you're not going to do it, I'm going to the tribunal. Because one of the things you didn't mention, Jules, of course, is the sheer number of psychologists who contact me who pull their hair out because of tribunals taking all the resource for a very, very small number of kids who actually don't differ from all the other kids, many of whom have actually got much greater problems but don't get themselves in this position. So this is the thing Mum said, basically said, well, I want them to go to this special school where they'll do special things, special teaching. Alex is not stupid. He is dyslexic. So again, what you've got is a false dichotomy between stupidity and dyslexia, which actually does not exist, which should not be there. And if it is in schools, we should kill it dead. The dyslexia idea, though, allows this association between intelligence and poor reading it allows it to survive rather than be challenged. What we should be saying is nothing to do with intelligence, the decoding skills. The things are unrelated. But this allows it to, so it prospers in this world. It doesn't knock it down, it makes it worse. Every child is entitled to the education they need. Well, yes, I mean, who would want to argue with that? But we're working in an age where resources are finite in a local authority. This is not the case in Alex's case. He needs specialist dyslexia tutoring. So I basically said, I've been talking to lots of psychologists around the country who have this kind of thing, and I say, why don't you ask them what this specialist dyslexia tutoring consists of, actually? Because it doesn't consist of anything other than the kind of really good tutoring that teachers' reading tuition provides for any poor reader. Obviously, you need people who know what they're doing and teaching and reading, but there's no dyslexia specialist tuition. There is really good teaching for kids who struggle to learn to read. My son is being let down severely by the school system. Well, maybe he does need more resource. But the question is here that the costs of the local authorities are paying for these kids who go to tribunals with this diagnosis, the amount of money that sucks out of the system, the resources that they would have to set up systems for helping large numbers of kids across the local authority or the multi-academy trust or whatever, it sucks it out, and so therefore there is no resource for the other kids. Now, if you've got finite resources and you've got a lot of need, how might you deal with it? Well, you deal with it by trying to find some criteria, which only means that you only have to deal with a small proportion of those people with a need, and of course that's the dyslexia industry. What it does is it takes the funding that's available out there and it puts it within the hands of a small subgroup of the other kids who don't get very much at all, quite frankly. And that, in my mind, is not equitable. Now, the other thing I get a lot of is, well, why don't you ask the dyslexic individual what they think? Ask them their opinion. Well, here's the problem. If we're saying that getting this label brings for that very small proportion of people vast advantage, should we say, in resource, if you're getting that kind of resource, but also the other advantage of the sympathy, the understanding, the teacher who'll go an extra mile, and all the sort of the avoidance of the attributions that those other kids are going to get. If you're asking those people what they think, well, of course they want the label, of course they like the label, of course they're going to say it's great. That is why the dyslexia industry always wheels out people who have been diagnosed dyslexic, because, of course, for them it's been very helpful. But when we're working across systems, as psychologists, special needs teachers, across local authorities, multi-academy trusts, across society, You cannot go to those individuals who've been given that extra help and ask them what they think, because they're not the ones who are losing out. One of the difficulties, of course, is that dyslexia is also got to do with identity, to do with people's sense of self. And, of course, very tied up with this. And then there's some people who argue that it's a bit like, the identity politics in terms of gender. The same thing here, that, if you believe you're dyslexic, if you consider yourself dyslexic, well, maybe then you are. But the trouble with that is, at the same time as we've got that model, we've got people going to legal cases arguing for specialist assistance, special help, and the two things don't work together side on side. So in my mind, you've got to look at it scientifically. You have to. It's not like I've spent a lifetime with kids who struggle to learn to read, who were crying at night, both as a teacher and as a child psychologist. It's not that I don't understand the emotions and the power and the stress and the anxiety and the tearfulness and so on. It's not that I don't understand that at the child's level, but what I'm saying is we have to think about it at a systems level to make sure that we provide the best system for all of society rather than the smaller proportion. Now, what I've got up here are, in 20 years, well, I've been going at this for 40 years, but in 20 years when I've been having lots of public debates, I've put down all the arguments against it. And I put this on a slide earlier, and I just wanted to run through, because these are the criticisms that are made of the position I'm arguing. And none of them operated in level of research or science, actually, or sustainable at that level. So let's start off. Firstly, the case for dyslexia as a special type of reading difficulty, a subgroup, has been secured by genetics, neuroscience, and cognitive science. Well, that doesn't stand up in the slightest, because all the studies of genetics or neuroscience and the cognitive science studies that are published in the top scientific journals are dealing with participant groups that have been selected on the basis of being poor readers. So here's just follow this one through. So you're going to do an fMRI, a functional magnetic resonance imaging study. You want to look at how the brain's functioning. So what you do is you identify a whole group of kids who are scoring on a reading test at the low level. So it might be the bottom 1.5 standard deviations or 1 standard deviation behind the mean, the bottom 10, 15%. You give these reading tests, you identify these kids. You then do the fMRI study with them. And you discover that maybe their brain functioning seems to be different than if you compare that with a group of kids who are normal readers. The only thing you have to remember is you can't do this at the individual child level. You can only do it at the group level, so it's no good for individual diagnosis or assessment. And then you publish the paper and you start talking about the brains of dyslexic children. But it isn't the brains of dyslexic children as the dyslexia industry define it. It is the brains of dyslexic children as defined by dyslexia being the synonym for reading disability, complex reading problems, bottom-end readers, the slide I put before. The same thing for genetics. Robert Plomin, who is probably one of the greatest geneticists in the UK, had something in the Times Ed last week, where he basically said, the genetic study, you just can't, you're wasting your time talking about dyslexia as a subgroup, it just doesn't add up. And funnily enough, the BDA didn't mind responding to that, even though they didn't want to come today. Well, maybe that's something else on today. But the studies of neuroscience, genetics, and cognitive science, then, are studies of poor readers. There's not studies of a subgroup of so-called dyslexics which operate within it. I keep saying that over and over again, but it's still the way it's promulgated. Secondly, the dyslexia label helps people who have real difficulties in their lives feel better about themselves, gives them a greater sense of competence and a greater sense of agency. Yes, I absolutely agree with that. But you can't. But by the same token, if you're going to do that, you have to do that for all poor readers. So, as I've suggested before, we could, if we want to, use the term dyslexia to describe all poor readers. That's fine. I wouldn't have a problem with that. It wouldn't really serve much purpose, because then it would just be a synonym for poor readers. But if we wanted to do that as a society and say every kid in the bottom 1.5 standard deviations below the mean, every one of those kids is dyslexic, let's do it. And then that problem goes away overnight. But of course, people don't want to do that. They want to create a subgroup within the larger group. The conceptual and diagnostic flaws identified for dyslexia are found in other conditions. And, Jules put this up with ADHD and so on. Well, there's two things here. I'm driving up the motorway and I get caught for drink driving. And as I get pulled over, the chap's talking to me about this, and I said, well, yes, I know I've had 4 or 5 pints tonight, but there's all sorts of people driving up this motorway, and they've had a lot more to drink than I have, so why are you bothering about me? The situation is we have to focus on this. The issue we're focusing upon is upon reading, upon the challenges of children out there who are not getting the support, the help they need, and are not getting prioritized. The other issues I mentioned earlier, though, where this argument falls down, is that all the other conditions do have criteria. There are criteria: autistic spectrum disorder, ADHD, OCD, ODD, anything you like. They've all got criteria, and there are treatments attached to them. Unlike dyslexia, there are no criteria and there's no treatment. So it doesn't even match up with the same. But the point that even if the other terms and uses are flawed, that doesn't mean that the arguments against this construct should be any different. Okay, although the criticisms of the construct are warranted, we should persist with a label in the hope that difficulties raised will eventually be overcome. This was argued in a paper in Science or Nature or something when the book was reviewed by an American neuroscientist saying, well, let's stick with dyslexia. It's all over the place. It doesn't mean anything. There's no criteria in some, but let's stick with this label because one day we'll know. This is a research scientist talking, not someone who works daily with children in local authorities where you have to make hard decisions about who gets help and who doesn't get help. Yeah, we're talking about real people, and we're making decisions about those people's lives. That's very, very different to abstract constructs out there, which you can have flying around there, and we can sort of get more precision as we move through that. Then we get into the fallacies of relevance. Firstly, the straw man, straw woman. So, one of the ways you do this is you put forward a completely daft, barking, mad statement, and then you attack it. So instead of dealing with the issues that we're raising today, people will say, well, you believe that you're the guy that says dyslexia doesn't exist. Well, actually, Simon and I wrote a paper years ago called Does Dyslexia Exist? And at the end of the paper, we said, of course, that's a stupid question. It's not a question whether dyslexia exists or not. The question is, if we're going to use the concept of dyslexia, what are we talking about? And are we talking about something meaningful? Are we talking about something that has some utility, that we can justify? It's not about whether it exists, because as soon as you say does dyslexia exist or not, the straw man, straw woman argument is, well, of course they don't know what they're talking about, because there are kids out there who really struggle to learn to read and have all sorts of problems. Are they saying they're not real? And of course that's a bit of rhetoric. It's clever rhetoric. But of course it doesn't make sense at all. Ad hominem attacks. Well, one of the ad hominem attacks, I get all these all the time. You're trying to flog a book or something like that. If these people knew how many sales of really highly academic books you'll sell, you'd be much better off doing something. Really, you're not going to make a living doing that. But it's this kind of some kind of personal attack, which is what happens quite a lot with me. I used to get criticised years ago as saying, it's just your opinion, there's no science, it's just you're just saying this. Produce the evidence, write it down. So this went on and on and on, so in the end I said, okay, I'll do it. I wrote a book. It took me 5 years to write it with Elena. And as soon as the book came out, they said, you're only saying this because you want to flog your book. you can't win, okay? Ad verencundium. What's ad verencundium? This is where you make... Thanks, cheers, Greg. Thank you. Is that saying great speech, or is it saying you got 10 minutes? 10 minutes. Oh, right. Pity. Okay. Okay, the Latin scholar, we went to the same school together, and he did better Latin than I did, obviously. What's this? This is where you appeal to an authority in some kind of way to legitimize your ideas. Who would we want to appeal to? We don't like what's going on in Warwickshire, so who are we? And we want to appeal to higher authority. Where's a higher authority than someone in the House of Lords? Years ago, when the book first came out, the GMTV said, can you come on and do an interview on the show? I said, fine. Who am I up against? Who's the other side, as it were? Duncan Goodhue. I said, well, the only Duncan Goodhue I know is a brilliant breaststroke, got a gold medal in the Olympics. So I don't know any other Duncan Goodhue. That's the guy. So I'm up against the blow. I spent 5 years researching all this stuff and 40 years in education with kids. And the person you're bringing out to discuss this with me is an Olympic swimmer. The Fonz is another one. Susan Hams, they're trying to get Richard Branson to fight. They're trying to get Richard Branson to go on against me at some point. Susan Hampshire. All these sort of people, if you wanted to discuss these issues, are these the right kind of people you really want? Why? Because you're dealing, again, at that emotional level of the individual talking about the problems they've had in their lives, the power of the individual who talks. But what we're trying to do is have a rational understanding of complex scientific issues with powerful implications for policy and social equity. And the rhetorical device people use to try and deal with the fact that they can't win that way is to get individuals to talk about their personal life journey. And of course, it's powerful and it wins over with some audiences. Some of the advocacy groups who aren't here with us today, what they do is they will go around and they will talk at that level, and that will be really, really powerful in that audience, but it doesn't butter the parsnips with hard-nosed educational psychologists from local authorities, and that's why in an audience like this, it doesn't work. Okay. Oh, sorry, I'm coming back. Sorry, I've forgotten about the last one. Ad populum is, everyone knows what dyslexia is. The clinicians know. We kind of know. This happens all the time. We kind of know, the public know what we mean when we talk about dyslexia. Clinicians know and so on. I know it's all over the place. It's a bit vague, but we have a kind of the wisdom of crowds and that sort of thing. Of course, that doesn't stash up. And then arguments of ignorance, which comes in. Frank Ramu wrote this in Brain or something like this, a review of the book. Frank Ramu is one of the leading French neuroscientists. He said, something along the lines of, well, yes, at the moment we don't know of any interventions you would give for a diagnosed subgroup of dyslexic individuals which differs from that from anyone who's not diagnosed as a poor reader. We have no knowledge of a special treatment. But maybe one day we'll find it, so we should keep it in the hope that one day we'll find that. Well, that doesn't really work, I don't think. I can't understand it. Come with the evidence of something you found that works, then we can talk about it, not beforehand. And then the final one, which I actually have quite a lot of sympathy for, which is despite the flaws of the dyslexia construct, and a lot of people in the dyslexia advocacy world, when you're sitting with a glass of wine over dinner with them, will say, well, you're absolutely right what you say, but their construct has the power to influence government policy and lay perceptions in ways that can lead to legislation resourcing that would otherwise be difficult to access. And that's absolutely true. So the fear might be that if we stopped using the word dyslexia and talked about children with reading difficulties or reading disabilities, would that reduce the pressure upon funders to provide the support those kids so desperately need? And I guess we'd have to, that's a battle we need to fight, in my opinion. I said earlier, you could call all those kids dyslexic if you wanted to, but what Simon and I wrote in our paper in 2009, and this is the position of most of the serious researchers in the reading world. So we all got into a room, 10 of us actually got into a room a couple of years ago, Maggie was there, Dorothy Bishop was there, and a load of people flew over from the States and from Europe. And basically, what we're talking about is a difficulty in learning to read which is highly resistant to efforts to intervene and to remediate. And it's this resistance to intervention that's highly problematic. So what we were suggesting is, if we're going to use the term dyslexia, let's use it to describe that population of people who have had high quality, really great, evidence-based intervention for a lengthy period of years and are still resisting it, because there are some kids who just don't make progress, some adults who just don't make progress whatever you do. And so why don't we use the term dyslexia to describe people at the end of their sort of journey of education, when you come to a point when you say, you know what, this person's going to need technological support, assistive technology in their life. They're going to need Dragon, voice activation. They're going to need the pens that you run along the line that read the text for you and put it in the book. We need to use technology for these people. So when we use the term dyslexia, we are talking about people who need to go beyond the educational, to go beyond the best forms of intervention we have. And what this would do is unlock resources for that particular population. So I don't have a problem with the word dyslexia, as long as we use it in a meaningful, valuable way. And that is what we've done. But the thing, of course, with this is you would never be diagnosing people with dyslexia at the beginning. You would be intervening with all the people who are struggling with, and at the end, if you say, you know what, We've done the best we can. We've done all the various forms of intervention. We've had lots of resource. We've had highly intensive interventions and so on. This individual is still not getting it. We need to do something else to help them. Then we've suggested that, but that one went down like a lead balloon, like a Sunderland fan in Newcastle city centre, I suppose. Okay, that was the Robert Plomin, the researcher in, who's the geneticist, and he wrote this piece in the Times Ed about why you can't diagnose dyslexia. So if I can just sort of sum up then, what I'm arguing here.
3 minutes.
Are you prepared to negotiate on this one?
No.
Oh, he's tough, isn't he?
No, this deal is not negotiable.
Okay, right, okay. I wouldn't have bought you that cake at lunchtime if I'd known, but okay, so here I've got 3 minutes to sum up. The situation is that there are many, many youngsters out there who need help. We have created a means of assessing a small proportion of those people using totally spurious criteria, without no real criteria at all. We're just selecting those people who come through the door, and we're pulling those people out, and some are getting extra resource, financial, some are getting more understanding, more help, or whatever. And there's a whole load more, much more youngsters who are not getting this help at all. The tribunal system is making that even worse. What we need to do is to create systems that allow us to intervene as soon as we possibly can for all children who are struggling with their learning. In this case, reading, but it can be other things as well. And we need to identify those kids at an early age, and we need to put into place great forms of intervention which will help all kids, whether they've got parents who will fight for them, who will advocate for them, like the one on that screen, or whether they don't have that. And this is the kind of thing that Warwickshire and Staffordshire and other local authorities, psychologists around the country, want to do. We want to find ways to help all people. And so in a moment, you're going to, after coffee or tea, you're going to hear from Warwickshire and Staffordshire, and also from Jonathan Solity. You're going to hear about the kinds of things that they're trying to do to make sure that all kids get help, not a subgroup identified on spurious criteria. Okay, thank you very much.
Well done, Joe, and well done for finishing off in 2 minutes. Friends, it's 3 o'clock. We're going to take a break now. I suggest that with the number of people here like me desperately needing the comfort break, 15 minutes. Please all be back here by 15:15 at the latest. Thank you.
Sitting next to me was
oh dear.
Right. Do you know which of these is a presenter view?
Yes.
So you can see what's coming up next.
Oh, so,
Does it have that option here? No.
I only know that the slide shows you which would be that one.
Okay.
But you want to present it.
Maybe this. I'm surprised it hasn't got that. Okay, use presenter view.
Oh, there you go. So go into slideshow and see if it then gives you presenter view. So if you, let's see if it lets you keep your notes.
No, it doesn't.
Right.
Does it have a presenter view here?
I'll ask Tom again.
It looks as though it doesn't.
I keep asking Tom, but I don't think he actually knows anymore.
Now,
I'll ask him.
Which is the microphone?
I think it's this one. No, try the other one. No, maybe it's just switched off at the minute.
Maybe it's not on. Excellent, Logan.
Yes, I gather you and our friends.
Mine will be about 35 minutes. But we've got loads of time if we start at, because we're due to start at 3:30. Yeah. So if we're starting early, I'll take the extra 5 minutes, if that's okay.
What's happening next? Are you going straight on?
Yeah, but it's a bit early.
You were going on at 3:45 and there was going to be a debate.
Oh, there's supposed to be some questions in there.
There will be, allegedly, but I don't know the system, so
There are going to be questions.
waiting for one of the locals to tell us about that. Ah, here comes Tom. Right. He says the microphones are working.
Okay, but
Hello. Oh, yes, they are.
I think there's meant to be a discussion.
Now look, do you want to?
Yeah, hang on, before that, I think there should be a discussion based on those two presentations first.
No, because no. Here we are. That's in there.
Well, then you put
it doesn't work. It doesn't. It's not been opened yet. We're gonna have a very brief announcement from Tom just there, right first, and then keep it in your pocket.
Do you need to use this?
Only for 1 second. Keep it in your pocket, and then when I hand over to you, we'll clip this on your lapel. All right?
Excellent.
Okay, friends, thank you for being so prompt. We need to resume now, and we're going to start the second part with a very brief announcement from Tom.
Just to say, we've had a few comments about the temperature in the room. I'm told it feels a little chilly. The heating will gradually warm up over the course of the next session, so you might want to keep your coats on just for a few more minutes, but then it'll become more bearable.
Hello. What?
You're using the lapel, not to put it right to your hand, because it's actually
I
really
know,
loud.
it's going to go on to...
Yeah, it destroys.
Yeah, yes, I agree. Okay, thank you, Tom. And even the 1/4 kilowatt that we're each emitting is not entirely warming up the room, but it will gradually do so. So next it's Dr. Jonathan Solity from Optima reading, his own firm in this area, and over to you after I clip it on your lapel. Hold on.
The other side.
Are you there?
Okay.
Very good.
Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about is assessment through teaching and response to intervention as a way of identifying the most effective ways of teaching children that are perceived to have a difficulty in learning. And this gives you a brief overview of what I'm going to cover. I'm going to cover some of the conventional wisdoms, some of which have already been mentioned, but those relate to the ability-achievement discrepancy, diagnosis and labels, and then I'm going to begin to identify what could constitute a well-founded intervention, and I'm going to be drawing on instructional psychology and direct instruction, and I'll highlight the underlying principles that relate to both those models, and then I will put a well-founded intervention in the context of assessment through teaching. That's the model that I'm familiar with. I think some people also refer to the idea of response to intervention, but in the way I'm using the terms are actually identical. And then I will conclude by looking at some barriers to implementing the kinds of interventions that I'm talking about. So let me start with where I began in learning about teaching reading. I was very well prepared on my PGCE. I had half an hour on one Tuesday afternoon in Liverpool, and I felt really well prepared. I then taught in a first school in Bradford, and Bradford had first schools for 5 to 9-year-olds, and I was teaching year 3 and its equivalent. And I was given one pupil, that one pupil was identified in my class before I even started teaching, and I was told that Linda had been diagnosed, or not diagnosed, she had been given an IQ test, she wasn't reading, she had an IQ of 70, and therefore she had to stay in a mainstream school, and unlike her brother who was now in a special school and had severe learning difficulties. And I began thinking about how to teach reading with my vast expertise, and really I thought, okay, I would use a process of trial and error, because obviously I didn't have a clue. So I used a process of trial and error and trying to work out logically, given the books that Linda had to read, what might work. And I gave Linda 5 minutes a day throughout the academic year. But I was spurred on by the fact that I was wanting to question whether or not having an IQ of 70 would make any difference. That was the prime motivation. And what I found over a period of the year was that Linda learnt to read successfully, not necessarily through my efforts. Partly it was through her motivation and willingness to learn how to read. But it seemed to me that the IQ diagnosis or measurement made no difference at all to how she learned. I then went to work as a psychologist in Walsall for 5 years, where I refined my understanding of trial and error through this process of assessment through teaching. And early on in my career in Walsall, I went on a series of workshops which were connected with direct instruction, which I'll mention in a minute, which gave me a very clear view about how to begin to design effective instruction. But what I also realized with my originally limited but growing expertise was that I was asked to assess a large number of children in Walsall. And over a period of 5 years, and assessing large numbers of children, I never found anyone that needed to be placed in a special school. It wasn't because of what I did. The teachers were operationalizing this trial and error-based teaching, and they were finding success, so that those children they originally thought had a difficulty didn't. I then moved to the University of Warwick, where I lectured for 23 years, and during that time did a large amount of research that again built on my earlier knowledge. And what we began doing was researching effective interventions to teach children to read and to prevent difficulties. And in this research, we received a significant amount of research funding, and we were able to compare interventions, and we were able to begin to identify what it was that might cause problems for children, and equally what would be successful. The workshops I attended in the early 80s on direct instruction were presented by the people that wrote the DISTAR programs, Doug Carnine, Wes Becker and colleagues. And a recently published paper highlighted and did a meta-analysis of 50 years research in direct instruction and indicated how successful direct instruction programs had been for teaching reading, maths and spelling. And the interesting thing about the workshops is that they didn't come and tell us about the programs they'd developed. They talked about the instructional principles that underpinned the programs. And that was very powerful because it gave me a means of going back into Walsall, using the principles on all the curricula that were in use in Walsall schools. The DI people had some kind of slogans that they promoted or talked about and that they presented to the children. So for the children, they were being told, look, what the task is to teach you more in less time. And if you work hard, you get smart. It wasn't, that was the overriding idea. And that they also talked about a concept that I hadn't come across before, which was faultless instruction. The assumption was that if the teaching was right, children would learn, irrespective of their individual characteristics, and that there were no children that couldn't be taught if the teaching was right. And if children didn't learn, that told you something about how they were being taught. And what mattered, and where direct instruction differed from the behavioral approaches and teaching to objectives that were prevalent at the time, was in focusing on teaching generalizable skills, not through relying on the capabilities of children to generalize, but through analyzing the curriculum. So here is the conventional wisdom, and it was clearly expressed in the House of Lords, where Lord Addington said that early identification is essential and accurate diagnosis is critical. And of course, no one would disagree with that, and as you've seen, there was no indication in the Warwickshire or Staffordshire guidance that suggested either of those factors were not being considered and were not thought to be useful. Slightly more worrying was when they then went on to talk about dyslexia not being something that the authorities cared about, that they refused to accept the diagnosis. And that was a misrepresentation, again, as you've seen, of what was actually printed in the guidance. And then this remote is not, oh, there we go. Then it was taken a step further by Lord Watson, who in fact is a Labour peer, who was suggesting that because Warwickshire was indicating that dyslexia didn't exist, were they also telling residents that the earth is flat and there's no global warming? Well, actually, as a resident of Warwickshire, whose children have been through Warwickshire schools, no, I've never been told by Warwickshire that the earth is flat. And in fact, from my experience of Warwickshire as a local authority, they've been exemplary in catering for the needs of all pupils, particularly those that are seen to have any kind of difficulties. So this certainly doesn't square with Lord Watson's characterisation. Then I began to look at what it is that the BDA are offering. And they are offering educational psychology assessments at £720 a time. And as you've heard from Joe, what they are also focusing and beginning to diagnose is a discrepancy definition. And you've heard, and I will tell you shortly, why that way of assessing dyslexia is not acceptable. But what this highlights is that you need £720 if you go to the British Dyslexia Association in order to get a diagnosis. And equity is what matters here. And children, irrespective of how you label their difficulties, it's the responsibility of the local authority to ensure that all children have their needs met and identified. So what is the evidence? Another recent article in the Times Educational Supplement looked at what the impact of a diagnosis was. And in the article, it said that a diagnosis doesn't respond closely with children's performances on a range of tasks. In other words, having the diagnosis didn't identify any particular characteristics of the children, and it didn't enable you to predict what their learning outcomes might be. We did some research a couple of years ago where we did something similar. We looked at children on school entry. We gave them a whole battery of tests that were thought to predict dyslexia, and what we found was that there was no single trait that accurately predicted children 3 years down the line after starting school. We couldn't identify which children were going to have difficulties and which were not based on those initial assessments. And there was a debate in the journal that educational psychologists often write in over 20 years ago. There was a debate featuring a number of articles, and Keith and Paula Stanovich contributed to the debate and concluded in this way. There's no indication in terms of etiology, cognitive profile, or brain mechanisms underlining word recognition that non-discrepant poor readers differ from their discrepant reading counterparts. In other words, as you've heard before from Joe, there's no difference between the groups of poor reading children with high and low ability in how they learn to read and in what their cognitive profiles are. So what is dyslexia? Well, Maggie Snowling was on one of the Times Educational Supplement podcasts recently and said dyslexia is a specific difficulty in learning to read and write. And in 2011, she wrote an article with Charles Hume in which she said that the way to identify which children are dyslexic is through a teaching and through what is termed a well-founded intervention. And that's the real task. How do you begin to identify what a well-founded intervention is through which you can begin to identify if children don't succeed in reading who might have a difficulty? And as for the label, well, I think what the debate has highlighted so far is there are two separate issues almost. One is, how do you begin to identify children that might have a difficulty? And let's just say you can identify a group of children whose learning is very slow and very poor. Then the question is, what do you call them? I tend to talk about children with low attainments or lower achieving pupils, and I tend not to use the term dyslexia, largely because at the moment it means too many things to too many people. So how did we in our research go about identifying a well-founded intervention? We took a different starting point. What we were aware of is that since 1998, when the National Literacy Strategy was introduced, a number of programs have been introduced to teachers which they have loyally tried in good faith, being told to do it by the government, and we've gone through 3 variations of the National Literacy Strategy, and it ended up with letters and sounds, which is still used in schools today. And since 2010, it's all been about synthetic phonics. I probably shouldn't say this because it's being videoed, and it might be shown elsewhere, but one thing but I'll say it anyway. One thing that I've learned in over 40 years in education is this. When I began over 40 years ago, the Bullock Report had come out. And when the Bullock Report came out, one of the things it identified was the tension between whole language and teaching phonics. And in many respects, we're still here. And despite 40 years of different governments trying different things, culminating in a coalition government introducing synthetic phonics, the one thing I've learned is that whatever the government tells you to do, it's invariably wrong. And I think that is still the case here, as I will go on to show you. Because all of these programs are flawed. Yet they are backed by government rhetoric, huge financial investment. There is no evidence of impact. There is no program that has been introduced to schools which has been compared through a randomized controlled trial where the results have been published in refereed journals. That is as true of the programs being used today as any that have been used in the past. So we have taken and thought about a different starting point in our research, which began with the curriculum. When you look at the synthetic phonic programs that are around today, they're all based on the idea that there are 44 phonemes in written English, and the task in teaching children to read is to identify how those phonemes are represented in graphemes. I don't know whether there are any parents in the audience or non-educationists, but just very quickly, a grapheme is the print, and a phoneme is the sound. So the grapheme is H, and the phoneme is, sorry, that's not me being hoarse, it's me trying to pronounce H. Okay, and sh is the SH is the grapheme, and the phoneme is sh. And so that's what the teaching reading is trying to do. And in some research done a number of years ago, it was found that the 44 phonemes can be represented by 461 graphemes. That in fact there are 193 grapheme phoneme correspondences, which is a term for linking sounds with the letters that represent them. Most commercial synthetic phonic programs have about between 100 and 130. And the phonic screening check potentially assesses children on 85. We took a different starting point. Instead of saying, here are all the phonemes and how are they represented, we began by looking at and thinking about, well, what is it that children have to read? What is the end point of reading? And clearly that's a range of what you might call real books, which I distinguish from books that appear in a reading scheme. And we were wondering, okay, what if we identify what appears frequently in real books? Maybe that would give us a starting point for thinking about teaching. So we created what we've termed a real books database. And in the database now, we have almost 1,500 books. And these are real books. There are no books from reading schemes. And that has generated just over 21,000 different words and roughly 1.5 million words in total when you take into account repetitions, and this is including mono and polysyllabic words. And what we found when we analysed the words, we created an algorithm that was analysed by computer scientists based at Warwick University, and what we found was just 16 words account for almost a third of all written English in children's books. We found that 100 words account for 54%. So over half of the words in written English are accounted for by just 100 words. And if you go on and teach more, then the return is vastly diminished. And this reflects Pareto's law, or the 80-20 principle, that if you carry on teaching more and more high-frequency words, the return is just 5% for the next 50 words. And you may recall that letters and sounds actually taught children 300 high-frequency words in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. So roughly 200 words that children were being taught would largely be redundant in the books that they would then go on to read. And the picture is pretty much the same when it comes to phonics skills and grapheme phoneme correspondences. When you look at what is actually in written English, there's a law of diminishing returns. You have a number of grapheme phoneme correspondences that are high-ranking, that occur a lot, and account for the majority of the phonics skills used in children's written English. 10 single-letter graphemes, grapheme phoneme correspondences, account for 70%, over 2/3 of all the single-letter grapheme phoneme correspondences that children will encounter, and 10 multiple-letter grapheme phoneme correspondences account for over 72% of all the multiple-letter grapheme phoneme correspondences. So if you teach just a small number of the most useful grapheme phoneme correspondences, then children will be able to read the majority of what they have to read when they progress from a reading scheme onto naturally occurring text. Where the problem arises, therefore, and why children might have problems, is because of what they are actually taught. This is not about what teachers do. The problem lies with the way programs are designed. And one of the things schools are required to do, because it's in the legislation now, is teach more than one phoneme for any grapheme. And that causes problems. Let's take the phonic check from 2018. The word chop appeared. And chop, or the CH, can have three pronunciations. It can be CH as in ch, it can be ka, and it can be sh. The letter O can be pronounced in two different ways. So chop has 6 different pronunciations. During the phonic check, how would children arrive at the correct pronunciation? It's either trial or error, or it may be that it's in their vocabulary and in their it's something that they know about, in which case it is language that is informing and helping children refine their pronunciations. Just out of interest, the word chapter occurred in the phonic check last year, which has, if you teach letters and sounds and everything in letters and sounds, and children have mastered it all, that accounts for 48 plausible phonic pronunciations. And we were just playing around, seeing which word had a large number of phonically plausible pronunciations, and the word banana actually has 864 plausible phonic pronunciations, given what is taught in letters and sounds. What we have also done is taken 5 synthetic phonic programs, and we've analysed what children would be able to read if they've mastered every skill in the 5 programs. In one program, there was only one phoneme taught for each grapheme. So every word that was decoded or is decoded wouldn't have an alternative pronunciation. It might not always be an accurate pronunciation, but there's only one pronunciation. With the other 4 programs, they varied between teaching 5 and 34 graphemes that have multiple pronunciations. And in these instances, what it means is, in one of the programs, which I think I can mention because it's letters and sounds and no one's heavily invested in that, if you are taught through letters and sounds and master everything, when you decode any word, 95% of the words you will have decoded could have an alternative pronunciation. So the question is, how do you get to the correct pronunciation when there are so many options? I'll return to that in a second, but before I do so, I also want to point out the fact that a large number of grapheme phoneme correspondences that are taught in commercial programs are redundant when it comes to the reading books that children progress to. So we looked at 3 programs, and we identified the 25 lowest frequency grapheme phoneme correspondences. And we looked at how many words that are phonically regular that would enable children to read in real books. And you can see the figures there. It ranged between 1.15% to just over 3%. So if you were imagining now we're talking about lower achieving pupils who are learning slowly, they then get to the point where they've got to learn 25 grapheme phoneme correspondences. I don't know how long that would take them. Let's say they're doing 1 per week. It's nearly 2/3 of the academic year learning 25 skills that will be of little value to them when they then go on to reading. Go on to read real books. If you combine reading a small number of high-frequency words that are not phonically regular with grapheme phoneme correspondences, what you find is that through teaching a small amount of information, you get a terrific return. Children would be able to read almost 80% of everything they would encounter in a real book. And you might be asking, well, what about the 20% that they can't read? And this is when I return to what happens when children decode a word phonically, but it doesn't lead to the correct pronunciation. Children make adjustments. It's called set for variability, where they hear a word that isn't quite right, and they adjust it and correct it. It's like children watching soap operas. If children watch Neighbours and all the other soap operas, I've never encountered a child who's come into school and said, look, I was watching EastEnders, and I can't understand a word they're saying. All the pronunciations are different. They're all kind of very strange. Children don't do that because they can make adjustments. And we called it in our research phonic self-correction. We were doing research in Essex, and children were going through the process of synthesis, which is putting sounds together to pronounce a word. And they were saying ba-ath, bath, g-r-ats, grass, f-ast, fast. And I said to them, why are you doing that? Surely you should be saying bath, grass, and fast. And they said, no, it's our accents. They were automatically taking their pronunciations and converting them to, taking the sounds and converting them to the correct pronunciation for them. We then began to do research on it. We took words that would give that could be could be decoded phonically, but would give a non-word pronunciation. One of the words is yacht, which can be pronounced in a phonically correct way as yatched. And we had 32 words of that type. And what we found was what determined whether or not children could correct their phonic pronunciations was whether the word was in their vocabulary. There were a number of other factors as well, but the main one was whether or not the word is in their vocabulary. So what it led us in our research to do, in developing a well-founded intervention, was to teach a small number of core skills, core high-frequency words and phonic skills, and then develop children's vocabulary. So they had a wide context in which to use and apply their phonic skills. We have also done research that's recently been published on correcting mispronunciation. So in our research, it wasn't an intervention, we were just identifying whether children had this skill of phonic self-correction or not. We've subsequently done research where we've trained children to correct mispronunciations, and through randomized control trials seen that that is something that is really a useful skill for children to acquire in order that it maximizes their use of the phonic knowledge that they have.
Jonathan, 8 minutes.
Right. Didn't quite hear that. It therefore led us to conclude, and in all our research done over a 25-year period, we have been teaching a small number of core synthetic phonics skills. And I'd like to emphasize, we're not talking about analytic phonics, we're talking about teaching phonics through synthetic phonics. A small number of high-frequency words in the context of real books, so that children are accessing immediately the books that they would most want to read. And this fits into theories of reading and how children learn, and we wrote about this in 2009, when at that point we only had a database of 64 books. As I said, it's now nearly 1,500. And what children will learn reflects the structure of the materials that they read. So it is quite likely that children will end up with very different hypotheses about what reading is when they read highly decodable, phonically regular text versus books that are real books, where there are a high number of phonic skills, but they're not presented, not every word is phonically decodable. And what we know through theories in rational analysis, which is an area of work that my colleagues at Warwick University were involved in, is that children will remember what occurs frequently, and they forget what is infrequent. So the task when teaching children is to help them realize what is really, really useful and what is less useful. Therefore, you would highlight for them in the teaching what is going to appear frequently, because that is going to be very useful, and they're more likely to then remember what they practice reading a lot, both out of context in teaching sessions, but then apply immediately to reading real books. And in fact, what is surprising is that children have more opportunities to apply phonics skills when using real books than when using highly decodable books. And that's counterintuitive, because everything you're told as a teacher or a psychologist is it's the other way around. And so we've been using books of this type to teach reading, and we teach grapheme phoneme correspondences and high-frequency words in order of frequency, so that children are beginning to know what is really important, what do they need to remember. And we do it through a process known as shared reading. It's sometimes called paired reading. And this is where children apply the knowledge they have to read the words that they encounter, and someone else who is reading with them fills in the gaps. It's what many parents and carers do with their young children before they get to school. Children are required to apply their skills with 100% accuracy. There's no guessing, there's no using contextual cues, there's no using picture cues, which is what is often implied by critics of real books, that they're using these alternative cues to read. They're only using the cues that they have been taught. And you can take two versions of the same story. The one on the left is a phonically regular version. The one on the right is a real book. It might surprise you to know that the one on the right gives children more opportunities to practice the skills that appear in the book on the left than the book on the left. Children would be practicing their skills more widely through the process of shared reading. And what we know is that children arrive in schools with very different language experiences. Some research recently conducted in London found that 1 in 3 children have no books in the home. So reading is a very different experience when you arrive at school not having seen books or encountered and you don't have a wide vocabulary, versus those children who've read books widely and do have a wider vocabulary. The same teaching approach is not necessarily going to work for all of them, but by using real books, you increase the likelihood of developing children's vocabulary and language skills. So, 2 other factors to consider in developing a well-founded instruction. One is connected with the instructional hierarchy. These are the stages to go through in the teaching and learning process. It starts by teaching children to become accurate, then they have to reach high fluency levels, and at that point, you would hope that the children's reading is sufficiently fluent that if the teaching was withdrawn during the maintenance stage, they would lose no fluency in their reading. thereafter they move on to generalizing and applying their knowledge. But for each stage, the teaching strategy is different, and it requires a different level of teacher input. And that's why one-to-one teaching is not always going to be helpful, because there will be times when children need to learn independently when they're developing their fluency. What also goes into a well-founded intervention is instructional principles. Here are just some of the instructional principles that we use in our, have used in our research. One is all the children have been taught by differentiated whole class teaching. One of the reasons was that when we began our research in Essex, we were told whatever intervention we came up with to try to prevent difficulties, there was no money available. If you came up with an intervention that required one-to-one teaching and therefore would be quite costly, we couldn't afford it. So we developed a strategy for whole class teaching, and I'm not suggesting anyone might use that, but that's what we actually did. So all the teaching was whole class teaching, and it was differentiated. We used distributed practice. Some people call it space practice. So instead of teaching for an hour a day, which was what happened originally with the literacy strategy, we split the learning up into 3 sessions of 15 minutes, distributed throughout the day. And one of the things we then do with the lower achieving pupils is give them more practice opportunities, because what the research in memory seems to suggest is the more frequently children recall what they need to learn, the more likely they are to memorize it. Interleaved learning, you can't see it very clearly on the slides on the left, but that is mixing the old and the new. So in every teaching session, whatever is being taught, children are taught something that is new to them. They're then given a practice to revise and practice something that is familiar, and then you put the two together. So at no point is what is familiar ever dropped from the schedule, and contextual diversity refers to the fact that children are more likely to remember any item, particularly words and grapheme phoneme correspondences, that they see in lots of different contexts. So the wider the context, the greater the likelihood of long-term learning. Right. Just 5 minutes to go then. So in a well-founded intervention, those are the features that need to go into that intervention to try and begin to identify who might have a difficulty. And it might be argued that if children have all of those things that I think are important and are still not learning, they may have a difficulty. But you may disagree profoundly with what I've suggested that should go into a well-founded intervention. And that's when we come to response to intervention. Because your well-founded intervention, what you think is accurate from the research, is your starting point. It's then a question of refining and developing your intervention depending on how children learn. If what is taught in the first instance doesn't work, you would move on to something else. And that's what the process of assessment through teaching does. It's a way of looking at teaching and learning, which always comes back, if children are not learning, not to look at the child, because we've heard a lot about assessment for diagnosis. This is assessment for teaching stroke intervention, where you're trying to refine and improve the quality of what you are teaching. And from what I've been telling you, the intervention needs to rely on optimal instruction and the theory of optimal instruction, so you only teach what is most useful. You decide what to teach by criterion referenced fluency assessment, so you pinpoint exactly what the children have mastered and what they need to learn next. And I know my son, if he ever hears this, will be horrified that I said mastered. What I meant to say was mastered. I come from Yorkshire, rather than Essex. Then the teaching methodology is determined in part by where the children are at in learning in terms of the instructional hierarchy and the instructional principles, and the organization is based on small group teaching, whole class teaching, or it can be independent, and some of that will depend on resources. But in our research, all the teaching was always done by the teachers, not by teaching assistants. We felt it was absolutely essential that the most vulnerable, lowest achieving children would be taught by the people who had been trained and had the greatest expertise to do so. That's not to criticize TAs or their motivation or anything about what they do, but we just thought that's how we wanted to proceed. And when it came to assessment, we would use ipsative assessment, which is used widely in precision teaching, but it's self-referenced. What you're doing is comparing the child's current performance with what they did previously. And in this way, it made teaching and learning a level playing field for all children. Because we said to children, look, some of you come into the class and you're taller than others, some of you can run faster than others have learnt more than their peers. You differ in all kinds of different ways, but the task for all of you is to improve. But actually, whether or not you improve is down to our teaching. And within this model, because what we were saying to the children is whether or not you learn is down to us, it took some of the pressure off children. Children didn't go away thinking, oh, we've got a difficulty, we're thick, we're slow. It was more, oh, well, our teachers are not doing very well. They've told us to go out and play tonight, have a good time. They'd go back to the drawing board and revise and rethink about how they were teaching. And in our research, and we've worked roughly in about 300 schools with 40,000 pupils. And we've reduced the incidence of difficulty from the typical 20 to 25% to less than 3%. So in a sample of 40,000, that's a reduction from about 8,000 to 1,200. A huge difference. And if you think of the cost of what it, to a psychological service, of trying to assess and meet the needs of 8,000 pupils versus 1,200, the difference is enormous. What we've been trying to do is reduce the number of false positives. And in a sense, that's what Joe was talking about when he was saying, well, if you want to use the term dyslexia, perhaps it's to this group of pupils. Perhaps it could conceivably, I'm not necessarily willing to accept this, but in theory, it could conceivably be used to the 3%. That those are the ones that we would want to spend more time and more resources investigating to find out how best to teach them. And there are huge financial savings through removing the false positives. Through the research that we did, all the children were taught by their teachers rather than teaching assistants. And in one local authority where there were 250 primary schools, we were able to quantify the cost of teaching on a whole class basis versus teaching children through Key Stage 1 with small group or one-to-one teaching. And that would have yielded a saving each academic year for that local authority of £112 million. So that's where some of the money could come from to look more closely at the lowest achieving pupils. And ultimately, we're trying to find out what works. In summary, and very quickly, here are some of the reasons why the current programs, and here I again would like to stress, I'm not talking about teachers and being critical of teachers. Teachers are doing the best they can with what it's recommended they do by government. Part of the problem is this. First of all, when a child is encountered as potentially having a problem in reading, low attainments on their own don't indicate that the child has a difficulty. It may reflect a number of other things. But when children are being taught through a reading scheme and through phonically decodable texts, they are expected to read those books with 100% accuracy. They practice skills out of context. When those are mastered, then they get the book. What that actually means is that the lowest achieving pupils, who in theory need more practice in reading, get less, because it takes them longer to learn all the skills they need to acquire before they get the book. Not only that, it means when they're reading, because they can read everything fluently before they get the book, they don't actually practice their phonic decoding skills when they're reading. Some phonic programs are not actually, some of the books are not actually phonically accurate. Here are just some examples of many that I could have presented. But the authors of most phonic programs don't distinguish, when you're teaching the modified E with U, between words that are pronounced as in brute, which is quite different from cute. It's the same with EW. You can have flu or new. The EW is representing different phonemes in those words, but then that's not considered. And equally in the word packet, we don't actually say packet, we say packet. And so there are many words, and there were 3 words in the phonics screen in 2017 that in fact were not strictly phonically regular, given the way children are being taught synthetic phonics. So some books are not as phonically regular as they're supposed to be. I've already mentioned the problem with teaching too many phonemes for graphemes and for teaching low-frequency grapheme-phoneme correspondences. And also, what you have to remember, and this may be a factor for children, is that if they're on a reading scheme, Ofsted has highlighted that for many children who are low attaining, they could be on a reading scheme throughout their primary careers, and therefore reading becomes a chore for them. barriers to, just a couple of minutes, 1 minute. Barriers, very quickly, barriers to progress. One is the way that teachers are trained, because what they're taught is deliver programs rather than being taught about the theory and research in reading so they can adapt and amend and refine programs when children are not learning. I didn't know there were so many educational psychologists in the audience, otherwise I would have not put this up. But I think there's also a problem with the training that educational psychologists receive. They may well have a single case study where they try and intervene with a child with reading difficulties, but overall, from my understanding of what happens, and I'm very careful here, from my understanding, what happens is that you get a lot of time to use different tests, but when it comes to interventions, not a lot of time is spent on interventions, and certainly educational psychologists in the field spend little time on interventions. And finally, we come to the government rhetoric and the way that they are responsible for what is happening in schools. The government would lead you to believe that everything is rosy and improvement has been dramatic since they came into office in 2010. The reality is very different. The PILS results that came out in 2016, which implied that England progressed from... I'll be very quick. I just want to finish this little bit off. With the PILS assessment, the government would have you believe that we progressed from 10th in 2011 and moved up to 8th. In fact, if you take out the results from the private schools in the PILS assessments from 2016, who don't have to do the phonics screen and they don't have to teach synthetic phonics, we actually came 11th in 2016, which is one place lower than in 2010. Those children who were in PILS 2016, who were supposed to have done well in Year 5, when they progressed to Key Stage 2 and did their SATs in 2017, 28% failed to meet the accepted standard going into Key Stage 3. 28% failed and didn't meet the right standards in reading. And reading for pleasure is a key issue. And we consistently, in all the PILS assessments from 2003 to 2016, are the lowest performing English-speaking country when it comes to reading for pleasure. And in 2012, when the screening check was introduced, the government, through an Ofsted report, also advised schools and recommended that they have policies in place for teaching reading for pleasure. That seems to have gone by the way. So finally, this is the final slide. We're just to start through what I've been saying in summary, is that you can't assume that at the point of referral or when you first notice children that low attainments reflect a difficulty in learning. The task is to identify and create well-founded interventions, and those are interventions supported by research. Then through the process of assessment, through teaching and response to intervention, we refine what children are being taught in order that they can learn, and because ultimately, whatever you call children, we want them to learn to read. And the only way of doing that is by the process of continually refining the intervention, and it is an issue of equity. In local authorities, which have large numbers of children whose needs they have to meet, they have to do it in a way that is equitable. And it can't be down to who shouts the loudest or who has the most money. It has to be done fairly. Okay, thank you.
Let me get that out of your pocket. Thank you, Jonathan. And now we hear from the people who are at or very near the coalface. So we have here Sarah Crawford from...
The other way round.
I've got you the wrong way round. Jo Ward from Staffordshire and Sarah Crawford from Warwickshire. And they're the ones whose document aroused so much criticism and, in effect, led to this debate. So, over to you. Now, who's going to have this, or are you going to sort of... All right, put that down there then, and then don't hold it too close to your mouth.
Okay.
Or otherwise you get the puff and feedback. Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Just to clarify, I'm Jo Ward from Staffordshire.
And I'm Sarah Crawford from Warwickshire.
And what a journey we've been on over the last few months. It doesn't feel like it at the moment, but we are really pleased to be here to have the opportunity to discuss our approach and our framework, because really we can't believe that a document we wrote that emphasises fair access to the available resources, early identification of needs and evidence-based intervention has caused such a fuss, really, and had such a negative reaction. So what we're going to spend the next half an hour doing is outline this framework, this approach that we're recommending, and share some case studies. I know Joe said he doesn't like case studies,
Joe.
but we've got a lot of examples and quite substantial data on using this approach in schools in Staffordshire and Warwickshire. And what we want to do is share this with you today, and also discuss the implications and the recommendations to share this more widely and what our hopes for the future are. Okay. So where did this start? Well, as educational psychologists, we start with the research. We've heard today that what we know from the reading science is that you can't separate dyslexic readers and other struggling readers in terms of the cause of the difficulty, the intervention that we use and the progress they make. So we listen to that. The other research we've heard today is from Solity about the critical skills in reading, the use of real books, and assessment through teaching. And that's what we're using as well. Another starting point is really our beliefs. Sarah and I worked together in Staffordshire for over 6 years, and what we've got really shared beliefs and a shared philosophy that we work to. We believe that all children can learn, but all children are different. And we can't make conclusions about children's progress and children's needs unless they've gone through a period of rigorous assessment through teaching that Johnny explained earlier. So as you can imagine, this has quite led to some frustrations in the traditional role of an educational psychologist. And what it has done is it led us to work with Solity in a project in 2011, where we piloted a different way of working as an educational psychologist. Instead of visiting schools, we brought schools together. And we brought schools together to share the research and to share what we knew about learning on a sort of a training-based approach. So the schools came to us and we met them fortnightly across the academic year. And what we found, we got some quite phenomenal results from that, and we'll share those results with you later. But what we wanted to do, and what we've been trying to do ever since really, is to bridge that gap between the research and what goes on in the classroom. So, and what I think we've done is sort of acted as that bridge. We've worked quite closely with Johnny and now with Joe Elliott to try and listen to the research and try and apply it to how we work as an educational psychologist in school. And that's really where the papers come from. Okay. So what we wanted to do when we wrote the paper was provide some clarity for teachers in schools about how we address literacy difficulties. So we're trying to empower teachers to address the needs rather than cause some confusion. And what we want to do is provide, what we've said in the paper is what we want to do is provide teachers with the knowledge they need and the confidence to address these difficulties. And how we've done that is by providing information about good quality assessments, so needs and difficulties can be identified as early as possible so we can intervene and make sure the interventions and the teaching strategies that we use are derived from research, that we're using those evidence-based that we know from the research about critical skills. So we're teaching the most generalisable skills, and we're doing it in a way that is dependent on the needs of the child and not anything else. So in that way, we're ensuring that children get fair access to the available resources.
So in terms of the document that we've developed, what are we communicating to schools? What's helpful to schools? So if we start with literacy-based assessments, the first thing we would say going into a setting is, you know, if a SENCO or a member of staff is saying to us, we've got this concern, this kid isn't reading, the first thing we would advocate is this isn't the only kid in your setting that is struggling with reading. And what we want to do is make sure that teachers understand that. They need to know that they've got to be addressing every struggling reader in that setting. So the idea is communicating the message that the assessments, the teachers, if they're identifying and recognising a delay in a reading skill or a spelling skill, a literacy delay, they are best placed to complete the assessments because they're teaching them, essentially. So our role is about making sure that teachers understand what the assessments are. We might model them to start with, but actually we really want to communicate that teachers are best placed to do that. And the kinds of assessments we're advocating are baseline data. So we would want a reading age to start with, a piece of standardised information, and that is just so that we can compare the progress over time. What's really important is that we develop quality, skill-based assessments that teachers know how to administer them and, really importantly, how to interpret them. And that's educational practitioners, that's teaching assistants, teaching staff across settings. And we want them to understand the importance of accuracy and fluency assessments, but also about generalisation. And what we've developed, and in Warwickshire and Staffordshire it's available to all our settings, is assessments that provide that information about accuracy and fluency of skills, but also the end point, the most important point, which is we want a child to be able to pick up a book of naturally occurring written English and read it for meaning. So we ensure that teachers are aware and have an understanding of generalisation assessments, and we'll talk about that a bit more as we go on. We also talk about cognitive assessments, and one of the criticisms was that we rule out cognitive assessments. That's not what we've put into that paper. Cognitive assessments can help to inform educational intervention, but what we're clear about is that addressing cognitive processes are not going to directly improve reading skills. If we want to improve reading, teachers need to be aware, educational practitioners need to be aware that they need to be focusing on the observable behaviours of the child. That's the reading and the spelling skills of the child. So cognitive assessments can be helpful in informing that teachers, of education planning, that they're targeting the curriculum at the appropriate intellectual level for that child, but it's not going to translate into effective instructional sequences. So we ensure that we might model it, but we want teachers to ultimately do that. And in fact, last week I was thinking about some training I was doing, and one of the teaching assistants involved went away, and I went back the following week, and she completed 15 baseline assessments of the Year 4 cohort of that school. That was actually 25% of the Year 4 cohort. That was all the children in that year group that the school were concerned about. And it's interesting that actually one of those children had a diagnosis of dyslexia, but actually what we looked at in an hour's consultation was refining the targets for 15 poor readers. And that's what this paper advocates. We address them all. They're equally important. Okay. So we also talk about the importance of assessment over time, which Johnny has talked about in his session. Another area of the document is about intervention and support. And again, we want to communicate to schools what's important so that they feel confident in addressing the needs of all struggling readers and spellers, all children with literacy difficulties. So curriculum access and skill development, we really need to ensure that schools understand that these are two very different issues, but they run alongside each other and they're equally important. And curriculum access is about ensuring, questioning the needs of the individual. Is the individual with the literacy difficulty just struggling with accessing the written word or recording, writing, or is it more than that? Is that young person requiring adjustments to the curriculum content as well? So it's really important, and that's where cognitive assessment can be helpful and can inform. But it's ensuring that that's appropriate and that the reasonable adjustments are in place in the classroom for the learner. And that might be assisted technology, that might be a reader, it's what's right for the individual. And I think what we need to be really careful about with this is that the emotional needs of that young person is at the forefront, and that's what we talk to schools about. And again, an example I can think about, a very recent example, was a Year 7 student who actually was a middle attaining student. So in terms of curriculum access, he needed to be in the middle attaining group in the secondary school, but he also required literacy skill development. So it was being very careful about the use of assisted technology for him within the middle attaining class in a way that he could manage. So it was really about thinking what was going to be most effective for him and helping him to start to use that assisted technology in a way that he felt confident in doing. And that was about peer mentoring. Skill development is the other area, and it's ensuring that the specific intervention comes from the assessment. So you're targeting the specific skill that needs developing. And again, it's going back to the assessment through teaching process. It's ensuring that the teaching is robust and scientifically valid. The intervention needs to be scientifically valid. And that's about a set core number of instructional principles that have been found in research to improve skills regardless of what you're teaching. And it's really important that staff are aware of those principles, which again Johnny discussed earlier, things like distributed practice, interleave learning, teaching to generalisation. So again, this is the information advocated in that practice guidance. So there's the assessment through teaching model we saw earlier, and it's essentially about making sure that we are evaluating the teaching in place. It's making sure that we're making constant refinements to the evidence-based, scientifically validated intervention that's been put in place, and it's adjusting the teaching in response to the learning. Okay. So just some examples really of how the practice guidance has influenced practice in schools. And, you know, we don't dictate to the schools how they implement this. We support in an advisory capacity. And it's very flexible in terms of how schools have actually used the approach. So just some kind of examples, some case studies. This is just the example of a journey of a junior school that I've worked with. And it did start with an individual case. It did start with one student that the school were concerned about their reading. And you can see over time, the assessment through teaching process was put in place. So it was about teaching the most useful skills, underpinning the teaching with the most robust instructional principles that we know improve learning, and then ensuring daily opportunity to generalise those skills. So that was the kind of assessment through teaching approach that was put in place. And you can see with this particular case study, which was very successful, there was a 68 months progress for this young lad for 27 months worth of effort. So very accelerated progress. And at this point, this is where the school sort of thought, you know, this is quite powerful information. And just to highlight here as well, this is about generalisation assessment. So we were talking earlier about the use of real books. And what the research suggests that if a learner picks up a book and they can access at least 95% of the text, so a 95% accuracy, and over a 3-minute assessment, just reading a book for 3 minutes, if they can read over 200 words in that 3-minute process, so that's the speed, they reach a threshold to be able to read for meaning. So their cognitive effort is no longer focused on decoding. So it's 95% at about 200 words. And again, you can see here, there was a 458% fluency increase and a 60.2 point increase in the accuracy. So the school saw this as powerful data, and they thought, you know, we need to be addressing more kids here. And that was their journey, really. Phase 2, they focused on a Year 6 group, and it was an 8-week intervention that ran. And they also used Year 3 as a peer comparison. So the Year 6 was, group were just the lower attaining readers in Year 6. And they found that there was an average of 12 months reading progression over the 8-week period. And one of the young people in that group, actually, where there was no months progression, made 11 months reading comprehension progression in that time. The Year 3 comparison group made 3 months progress in the 8 weeks. So actually that wasn't bad either, but the school recognised that actually if they wanted to have a more powerful intervention, it was going with the assessment through teaching process. And that school are now on to phase 3. They're targeting, they're a junior school, and what they're doing is their Year 3s, upon entry, they're assessing those children in the way that we described. And at this point, they're just, I think there's some trainees in the audience that have supported in the assessments, that they're targeting to the 25% lower attaining readers within Year 3. And they're also looking at putting that in whole class. And the message is really powerful from that setting. The message is, upon entry to our school, we have resources that are available to every struggling reader and speller that requires it, because we recognise that literacy is the currency for other learning, and we're going to get you, reading. Reading for meaning, reading for pleasure, and that's the priority of the setting. Another example. Thank you.
So what we were beginning to accumulate was, by using this research, by using the core instructional principles in the interventions, that we were gaining quite a lot of data about how this could be used in a mainstream school. So what we thought, well, how can we challenge this a bit further? Who are the most hardest to teach? Could this be used in our special schools, where there's children in those schools that are struggling with learning in general? So what I was at the time covering a secondary special school in our area, and I thought, can we replicate these results? So what I did, the school were willing to try. So the approach I used was that I know about the research, I know about the work we've done in mainstream schools, I know about the instructional principles, you know your school and you know your children. Could we work together to see if this could work? So I delivered some training sessions about the principles, about the assessments, the critical reading skills, the use of real books, and I left it to them to see how they could use it within their school. And what happened was they used the approach on 21 young people. I didn't give them any other sort of guidance, really. It was, here's the research, you go and use it as you think you could, how you could make it work. And what we found with those 21 young people, in a term, in 3 months, they made an average of 2.9 months progress. So these were children across the school from Year 7 to Year 13, and I didn't leave any data out. I included all the children, and what we found was, even if they didn't make any progress with their reading age, they were making progress with the accuracy of reading those 100 words, those 100 words that account for over 50% of written English. We saw improvements in the accuracy and the fluency of those skills, or improvements in their phonics skills, or they read more words out of a real book. So for all those children, we could show progress in that term. And I know this is only a very small sample, but we're talking here about age expected progress for the children that are the hardest to teach. So what we did following this is, I was working with a couple of teachers that wanted to use this on a whole school, on a whole class basis. So I was going to put this in a better form, but I thought I'd show you actually the working document that the teacher used. She had a class of 11 children in Year 8, and they ranged, as you can see from those bottom 3 rows, they had a reading age of between 4.5 and 10.3. So there was quite a range of a reading ability in there. And what she did the interventions twice a day. Once when they came in the morning, and then once when they came in after lunchtime. And she did it on a whole class basis. She used direct instruction. she was teaching accuracy and fluency, and she was using assessments, so the skills that she was teaching were completely in line with the skills of the class. And she was also reading with a real book with the children. So she continued the whole year, and what she's found, as you can see on the bottom there in red, the children made, on average, 9.3 months progress in 10 months. So again, nearly age expected. There was an average percentage point raise of 8.5% in their accuracy, and in 3 minutes they were reading, on average, 45 more words of a real book. So these were year 8 children who have failed. There was two children there, I think, with a reading age of 4.5 to start with, and they all made some progress in their They all made progress in their reading age, and they all made progress in their skills and their ability to read, to generalise those skills in reading a real book. So,
Sarah, Joan, 8 minutes.
We heard 8 minutes.
Yes. So the feedback from this project was, could you do this in the primary school? The feeder primary special school that feeds this, the secondary school. So that's what I did the following year. And they used it in a similar way. They used the process with 22 children in their school, and they found, again, with the Salford, an average of 11 months progress in an average of 11 months. They had a teacher that was using quite a lot of different assessments at the time, and for those children that registered on the YARC, which is a bit more of a sophisticated reading test, they made an average of 23 months progress in an average of 11 months. And what we also found was that there were gains in reading comprehension as well that was assessed by the YARC, even though that wasn't targeted, because it was decoding and reading that was targeted. So again, we've got some good data using this approach with the children that are the hardest to teach. So the final example we've got, we want to go back to the project where this started, really, where we were getting schools together and delivering and improving the skills of the teachers and the knowledge of the teachers in this approach. And what we found after the 2-year project, that school staff were reporting that their knowledge of the research had increased. Their teaching was more refined, and what was interesting for us is they were talking about using language like fluency, like generalisation. So the things that we were trying to put forward towards the end of the time, they were incorporating that in their language, and as a result, the children's metacognitive skills they were reporting were improving as well. That the children were starting to use this language. And as a result of all this and the data that was provided, they could use this more in decision making, who they wanted to see the educational psychologist, who they wanted to put forward for additional resourcing. They had more information, and they were able to make more informed decisions. And in turn, they had more transparent information to show parents as well about progress. So there was lots of other gains from this, as well as the reading gains. And I just wanted to finish really on some examples. That we had 14 schools within this project, and we didn't see any of the children. We were seeing the teachers. And one particular school, and we'll show you this one because this was the best one, that one school implemented it with all their children that had a reading age of below their chronological age. And what they found with those 93 children, there was an average of 15.6 months progress in 6 months. And the range there was between 0 and 42 months. And again, that child that didn't make any progress with the reading age, we could show progress in their skills and their generalisation. And what they've also found, which replicates Johnny's original research that children with a reading age below their chronological age reduced from 50% to 25% in that time. And children with a reading age of over a year below their chronological age reduced from 25% to 9%. So again, we were getting more information about those children that were the hardest to teach, because we were putting in what we could see was evidence-based intervention. So this was just another example of another school with 19 children making an average progress of 8.6 months in the 3-month period. So we've got quite a lot of data now about the effectiveness of the approaches and the research that we've included in the paper. So what we wanted to just finish off with was just a summary that this professional paper that we put together, we were committed to teaching literacy for all children by intervening early, using good quality assessments that assess the skills that are needed for the intervention, and to ensure that the interventions we use are shown to be effective in research. So in that way, we're working with the children with the most need, and therefore ensuring fair access to available resources and the expertise that's available.
And I think, you know, going back to kind of the paper, what all we're advocating is an effective system whereby learners, struggling readers, struggling spellers are identified as early as possible. And from that, good quality assessments, obviously, to identify, and then from that, scientifically validated intervention and that ongoing refining, so that the goal is to get all children reading for meaning, reading for pleasure, and leaving schools, and we can talk on behalf of Warwickshire and Staffordshire, leaving our schools as independent readers. And that's what the document advocates. That's all the document advocates. There's no need for us to spend the time and resources trying to prioritise one subgroup of struggling readers over another. If this model is adopted in schools, then it's an equitable, fair system for everyone, and they target every child, because that's a responsibility working within a local authority, is to target every child that needs support. So that's what we feel this advocates. That's all we feel this advocates.
Despite the debate that is going on elsewhere, we need to be thinking about what's important, and that's teaching the children to read.
That's it.
Running up and down.
Yeah, right. They were working earlier, but maybe they have to... Oh, it's a bit awkward if we have to try and that. Here we are, here's...
One, two, one, two.
That's fine, good.
1, 2, 1, 2.
Yeah, they are.
Thank you. What I think we'll do is have one amongst you up here, and I'll row the audience with the other.
Or should we row the audience for you? So
well, yeah, but then how are they going to be heard? Okay. And you're going to work right the audience? Okay, fine. Yeah, okay, good. Okay, good. Friends, okay, now here comes the bit you've been waiting for, your opportunity to put your points, your objections, your thoughts to today's speakers. And I'm going to moderate from up here, but Vivian, who really should be up here to be part of the panel as well, but never mind, is going to rove the audience with a microphone so that you can put your points to her and the panel. Okay? So you got the other mic? Oh, Tom's going to do it. Well, so you can sit here then. Lovely, good. So, who's going to be up first, please? Yes, just here in the front, Tom. Oh, one there as well. One there and then here.
If we're removing the label of dyslexia, what would be a better way to approach it? Would it be more fine-grained categories, or how should we approach it?
Okay. Well, I think it's. I think what we should be focusing upon are the behaviours we're concerned about. So we should be talking about children with reading difficulties or mathematical difficulties or whatever difficulties are concerned. So as far as reading is concerned, we just identify those children where problems occur. In a sense, where you make that cut-off is partly to do with where you've got resource. So when I was at secondary school Senko, we had a cut-off at our school at 9.5, and that was where children seemed to have special needs on their reading. But the school the other side of the city, where they had more disadvantaged kids, they had to make the cut-off at 9. It was a totally arbitrary distinction, purely on the basis of the number of children, the number of teachers, number of resources. But I think at least if we focus on the behaviours we're concerned about, that's the way we should be going through. We could call them reading difficulties or reading disability or whatever you want to do, but that would be my recommendation.
Well, you know what I'm going to say, just very quickly, don't get rid of it. And you know, it's 1 word, 4 syllables, instead of at least 2 words and 7 syllables, is it, for literacy difficulties? So, you know, it doesn't seem to make any sense to me to get rid of that. It just makes things more complex.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I quite like the slide that was put up by Joe towards the end of his speech about those remaining 3%. Both Jonathan and Joe highlighted that maybe those are the people we should focus our energies on, and what we call them, maybe something new, because I think this concept is very mucky and murky.
Good, thank you. Yes, just here.
Yeah, my name's David Morgan. I've got a point for Professor Elliott, that he seemed to suggest that taking a neurological subskill approach was irrelevant, and that really we should just go in through the reading. We've actually done a lot of work taking the opposite view, and that is that reading is a neurological process. It is a daisy chain of neurological facilities, and if you see a weakness in one of those and address it, then you can achieve a lot of improvement. And you know, we've got a lot of data to show that's effective. And an example of that is the vision therapy, which I agree often doesn't work, but we find around about 20% of the children we're working with, we can get to a point where they can decode very accurately with large text. They can't with small text, which has to be a visual effect. When we start to work the teaming and convergence of their eyes, then that is resolved. And so I do think that you can take a sub-skill approach and get a good result.
Well, there wasn't actually a question there, but yes, of course you may.
I think the thing is that, you know, I spent 40 years in this business speaking with people with all sorts of ideas. You know, the people who used to believe in the psychomotor, the kind of door and all those sorts of things, those people used to report all sorts of amazing findings, you know, and you can go back to Dome and Delicato and all sorts of things, systems of various kinds of procedures. But if you look at the scientific literature, what you find is that if you look at visual training, the scientific literature does not support that in terms of RCT designs, scientifically supportable designs, and that's why the American Academy of Pediatrics, by the British Medical Association, and all the other organisations, all those people say there is no evidence in serious, secure scientific studies where you've got randomly allocate people to groups and you look at that, there's no evidence that those work. As far as the neurological stuff's concerned, again, you can go around the country and you talk to people who do various things and they'll tell you what they do works really, really well. But what I'm interested in is to see whether or not that is replicated in scientific studies, also undertaken by people who are disinterested, who don't have an interest, an actual interest in the outcome one way or the other. So until that, the scientific literature is absolutely secure that you cannot improve underlying psychological processes of this kind. Just look at Jack Fletcher and Houston. I mean, Fuchs, all sorts of people will show you that doesn't work.
Good. Now, who else has got a question, please? Good, yes.
So how can we improve teacher training, initial teacher training, and for all teachers to actually be able to put this into operation from day one in every classroom?
I think you've put your finger right on the best question. Because unless unless the country intervenes at the initial teaching of initial training of teachers, nothing is going to change. To misquote our Prime Minister. Sorry. Yes? No, go on.
I do teach training. Can I do this? Thank you. Cheers. Okay. I spent an hour yesterday talking with the Department for Education about behaviour management, and they want to do exactly the same thing over the skills of behaviour. And I get like 2 hours with PGCE students on behaviour. The problem is the PGCE year is just insufficient to cover any of these things, behaviour, reading, everything else. You can't pack it all there. I did a 4-year teacher training course, and just about, in 4 years, you might be able to cover it. The reality is, if you're going to do a PGCE, and you're going to pack them in at October, and then they're going to come out in June, and it's going to be school-based, so there's a lot of practical stuff, you aren't going to be able to do anything in any kind of real depth. So therefore, your question about how can we do this as part of the teacher training might need to be sort of reformulated and think about how can we do a continuing professional development so that the teachers going into the schools will continue to become more skilled in this over a period of time, because it ain't going to happen in that 9 months of the PGCE.
And it will also, in my view, entail a change of attitude amongst those who are training the teachers. Yes? I won't quote the Latin tag for that, but never mind. Vivian, did you want to talk to this? Oh, there's another question. Sure. Where? You're next.
There's been a lot of emphasis on reading, but obviously dyslexia is much broader than that. I know you scoffed at the TES notion of how interconnected it is. But I find as an assessor that in schools where reading is taught well, children don't necessarily have a phonological deficit, because obviously our brains are rewired to read, but they have real difficulties in spelling and written expression. So how are we going to address that if we just get rid of the idea of dyslexia? It's much, much broader than what you're suggesting.
I agree with you, and since the phonological awareness or phoneme awareness, I don't think it is phonological awareness, has come in with the phonics check. When we were in Dorset, and we're just saying, when that came in Dorset, our referrals for children with reading difficulties didn't go down. If anything, it went up. But what we found was a different pattern of the difficulties we were seeing. So, I agree with you, and it certainly did affect spelling. No, that's what I'm saying, yeah. There's other difficulties, but our referrals did not go down. So, there's fire alarm.
Has the BDA been messing about with the fire alarms?
Okay, if you follow then the fire marshals out and the assembly...
Well, thank you, everybody. Take the directions of the fire marshals directing you